Carl Elliott married Lisa Elliott several years before the events that would tragically change their lives forever. Their love story was followed by the birth of their first child, a daughter named Felicia, and then just a year later, their son Gregory came into the world. Carl worked tirelessly, holding down 2 jobs as both a mechanic and a carpenter, doing everything he could to provide for his growing family. The Elliots lived in a cozy house situated on a decent-sized property in the small rural town of Dalton, Arkansas. Now, Dalton was a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else, and life moved at a slower, more peaceful pace. Behind their house, the Elliots had a mobile home set up for Lisa's elderly parents, who were facing serious health issues. Her father and stepmother both struggled with mental health problems, possibly dementia, and were slowly losing their hearing, so it was important for Lisa to have them nearby. They were family, after all, and Carl and Lisa wanted to care for them in their later years. The town itself was quiet, almost forgotten by time, but it wasn't without its darker sides. While it may have seemed like a safe haven, the lack of law enforcement presence made Dalton a prime location for the drug trade. But for the Elliots, life remained untouched by such troubles until the night of July 30th, 1998. That night, a fierce storm swept across the town, the rain falling in torrents, pounding the earth, and turning the streets into rivers. Around 1:15 in the morning, Deputy Randy Barber, who was on patrol that night, received a call about a domestic disturbance at the Elliott home on Township Road. When he arrived at the property, he could hear shouting from inside, but by the time he got to the door, everything was strangely quiet. The rain still pounded relentlessly, but there were no lights on, no signs of trouble. With no immediate reason for concern, the deputy decided not to perform a welfare check and left, thinking everything was fine. What he didn't know, though, was that the nightmare had already begun. As morning arrived and the storm slowly passed, Lisa's stepmother, Mrs. Dubois, woke up and went to open her front door. To her surprise, the door wouldn't budge. Something heavy was blocking it. She tried pushing against it, but it didn't move. Frustrated, she gave up and went around to the other side of the house. But when she reached the porch, what she found there would forever change her life. Lying in front of the door was the lifeless body of her 27-year-old stepdaughter, Lisa Elliott. Panicked, Mrs. Dubois rushed back inside to alert her husband, Kenny. Sheriff Rob Salmon soon arrived at the scene. When he knocked on the front door, he found it slightly ajar. Calling out to see if anyone was home, he was met with silence, only the faint hum of a television playing in the distance. The stillness was unsettling, and a sinking feeling began to set in. What had happened inside that home was far worse than anyone could have imagined, and what followed would leave the entire town of Dalton in shock for years to come. The moment the officer stepped into the house, the horror was immediate. Lying lifeless on the living room floor was young Gregory Elliott, just 6 years old. His small frame, still in pajamas, painted a heartbreaking picture of innocence lost far too soon. Sheriff Rob Salmons, shaken but determined, swept through the rest of the house in search of survivors. But what he found instead were haunting traces of a struggle. Blood smeared across the kitchen, splattered in the dining area, and even staining a child's toy telephone left behind on a desk. It was clear someone had fought with everything they had. Outside, Lisa Elliott, just 27, was still in the same spot where her stepmother had discovered her hours earlier, collapsed on the front porch. Investigators noticed a bloody handprint smeared on her father's door, suggesting she had tried to escape, maybe even call for help. But there was no time, and something was still terribly wrong. 2 family members were missing, 30-year-old Carl Elliott and his daughter Felicia, only 7. In cases like this, the spouse is naturally the first suspect, especially since he was missing alongside his daughter. But just 48 hours later, that theory was shattered. Carl's lifeless body was pulled from the nearby 11-Point River. He had been executed, shot twice in the back of the head with a .22 caliber weapon, and shallow knife wounds were visible across his throat. He had been silenced. The autopsies that followed were gruesome and deeply unsettling. Lisa had endured 27 blows to the head, each strike believed to come from a tire iron found at the crime scene. But what ended her life was even more vicious. The killer took the iron and drove it deep into her throat, cutting through her carotid artery and severing her windpipe. Gregory, her little boy, had suffered just as much. The same weapon had been used to stab into his throat repeatedly. His skull had been fractured by a blow, his jaw was broken, and knife wounds covered his tiny body. After Carl Elliott's body was discovered, one terrifying question remained. Where was little Felicia? The thought of a 7-year-old girl out there, lost, taken, or worse, haunted not only the family's loved ones but the entire community. Investigators searched for answers for 2 long years. Every lead ended in frustration. Every hope slowly faded. And with each passing day, the possibility of finding Felicia alive grew dimmer. Then, on a quiet afternoon, September 7, 2000, everything changed. The hunter was out near Warm Springs, deep in the woods, just doing what he normally did. But what he stumbled upon that day was no ordinary discovery. Lying in a dry creek bed were what appeared to be human remains. The area had been untouched for some time, nature slowly reclaiming what was left behind. The hunter quickly contacted the authorities, and when investigators arrived, they collected everything they could from the scene. DNA testing later confirmed the heartbreaking truth. The remains belonged to Felicia Elliott. She had been found, but the relief was quickly swallowed by sorrow. Due to how much time had passed and how far the body had decomposed, the medical examiner could not determine exactly how she died. During the investigation, many names came up, but one family in particular kept drawing attention. The Greens. They were no strangers to trouble. Living in nearby Randolph County, the Green family had a dangerous reputation. Billy Green, the head of the family, was a well-known drug dealer in the area. His oldest son, Chad Green, worked right alongside him, and strangely enough, Chad and Carl Elliott had once been close. They had done a few drug deals together. By all accounts, they had a good relationship, until suddenly they didn't. Something had happened between them, something that changed everything. Rumors began to circulate. Some said that Carl Elliott had stolen several marijuana plants from the Greens, and that the family was furious. Others whispered that Lisa Elliott, just 2 months before the murders, had reached out to someone, desperately asking for a loan of $10,000. She said they owed money to the Greens, and that she was terrified of what they might do. The Greens had a long history of violence and criminal behavior, so it was no surprise that the investigators kept their eyes on them. Over the years, the police questioned them more than once, but they never had enough solid evidence to make an arrest. It was frustrating, like trying to hold water in your hands. But then, almost 5 years after the Elliott family was brutally torn apart, fate stepped in. On July 29, 2003, a single piece of information came to light, and it changed everything. A confidential informant, later identified as Mary Green, Billy Green's former wife, shocked investigators with a crucial revelation that would begin to unravel the truth. Mary shared exactly what her son, Chad Green, had told her about the night of the murders. She also revealed things that Billy himself had confessed to her. According to Mary, on the evening of July 29, 1998, Billy received a phone call from Chad and left their home without saying a word. He was gone for hours, and Mary had no idea what was happening until 2 years later, when Billy finally admitted the truth. Billy told her that he had gone to meet Chad to help him clean up after the murders. Billy allegedly told Mary that Chad was responsible for all 4 deaths, the brutal murders of Carl, Lisa, Gregory, and Felicia Elliott. But Chad, in a twist, claimed multiple times that it was his father, Billy, who was the true culprit. This contradiction only deepened the mystery, but it also gave investigators a new lead. The breakthrough came when, just the following day, police arrested 27-year-old Chad Green and his father, 47-year-old Billy Green, on unrelated charges. While they were in custody, investigators began applying pressure, using this new information they'd received from Mary. Billy, calm and collected, refused to be shaken, but Chad wasn't as strong. Eventually, Chad cracked under the pressure and started talking. He agreed to testify against his father in exchange for a plea deal. The deal would reduce his charges to a 40-year sentence for his role in the quadruple homicide, and Chad accepted the bargain, hoping for a lighter sentence. With a heavy heart, Chad began explaining what had happened that fateful night. He confirmed that Carl Elliott had been involved in illegal dealings with Billy and himself, and even admitted that Carl had stolen from Billy, a crime that enraged the elder Green. Billy was furious about the theft and wanted revenge. Together, father and son had come up with a plan. Chad described how, on the night of the murders, the Elliots were getting ready for bed when a knock sounded at their door. It was Chad, claiming his truck had broken down about a mile from their house and asking Carl for help. Carl, being a friend, agreed without hesitation. They both got into Carl's car and left the house. According to Chad, when they reached the location of the broken truck, Billy was already there waiting. Without warning, Billy shot Carl twice in the back of the head, killing him instantly, and then pushed his body into the nearby river. Afterward, Billy and Chad took Carl's car and drove back to the Elliott residence. As they returned, Billy made it clear that they had to clean up the loose ends. That's when things took a horrifying turn. As they pulled up to the Elliott home, young Gregory Elliott saw his father's car and rushed to the door. Who exactly Gregory encountered remains unclear, but according to Chad, it was Billy who greeted the boy at the door. Chad stayed outside by the car, but was soon startled by the sound of shouting and chaos inside. Concerned, he went in to check on his father. That's where he allegedly found Billy violently attacking Lisa Elliott. Billy, seeing Chad, quickly ordered him to go back outside, saying that the situation didn't concern him. As Chad continued his chilling recount, he recalled turning to leave the house, only to see young Gregory Elliott lying lifeless on the floor. After Billy finished with Lisa Elliott, the mother, he went on to find the final member of the Elliott family, little Felicia. She had been hiding in her bedroom, terrified. Billy wrapped the small child in blankets and carried her outside. Chad could see that Felicia was still alive, moving slightly, but that wouldn't last for long. Billy, without any hesitation, placed the girl into the trunk of the car, taping her hands and mouth shut to ensure she couldn't escape or cry out. As they were about to drive away from the Elliott home, something caught Billy's eye. He looked out the window and saw movement across the yard. It was Lisa Elliott, still alive, crawling across the lawn. Billy didn't think twice. He got out of the car and, without mercy, ended her life. Once Lisa was no longer a threat, Billy returned to the car, and the two men left the property, seemingly unfazed by the carnage they had left behind. However, the horror didn't end there. Chad later claimed that Felicia Elliott was kept alive for 2 more days, 2 agonizing days. She was locked in a trash can inside the garage, where the temperature soared well above 100 degrees. The poor little girl endured unspeakable horrors during those days, and Chad claimed that at one point Billy uttered a chilling phrase, "All good things must come to an end." It was then that Felicia's life would be tragically snuffed out. Billy, with no hint of remorse, drove her to a creek about half a mile from their home. There, he forced her head underwater, holding her down until she could no longer fight for her life. To finish the horrific act, he slashed her throat, ending her life on the night of August 1st, 1998. The investigation and legal proceedings would drag on for years, but justice seemed to finally be within reach. In the year 2004, both Billy and Chad Green were convicted of the murders. Billy was sentenced to the death penalty for his role in the brutal killings, while Chad, who had cooperated with authorities and provided critical information about the murders, received a plea deal and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. However, just when it seemed like the case had been resolved, an unexpected turn of events occurred. In the year 2006, the Arkansas Supreme Court made a shocking decision to overturn Billy's conviction. The reason? A significant legal error. A key witness for the prosecution had testified that she believed Billy was responsible for the death of her nephew and claimed she was terrified of him. But her testimony was based on an unrelated event entirely, and the court ruled that this should not have been allowed. This was seen as a serious breach of legal protocol, and as a result, Billy's conviction was thrown out. A new trial was ordered, throwing the case back into the public eye. In the second trial, which took place in May of 2012, Chad refused to testify against his father. This refusal to cooperate effectively voided his original plea deal, and he would need to be resentenced. One of the most pivotal moments came from a witness who had once been Billy's cellmate in the Arkansas Department of Corrections. This inmate, who was housed with Billy at the Federal Correctional Institute in Fort Worth in 2008, would provide crucial testimony that would ultimately shed more light on the chilling events leading up to the murders. On May 3rd, the inmate testified about what Billy had confided in while they were in prison together. According to the inmate, Billy revealed that his son, Chad, had hurt Felicia on multiple occasions prior to the murders. The young girl, too afraid to stay silent, had allegedly told her father, Carl Elliott, about the abuse. Billy's response was chilling. He claimed that Felicia's father had been planning to take the information to the sheriff. Billy said this is why Chad had gone to the Elliott home in the first place, to stop Carl from going to the authorities. Billy explained that, in a fit of rage and desperation, Chad decided to lure Carl to the 11-Point River, where he shot him. But the violence didn't stop there. Billy said that once Chad returned to the house, he killed the remaining members of the Elliott family, sparing no one. The inmate testified that Chad stabbed Lisa Elliott with a Felicia. Billy also claimed that Felicia's final words were a heartbreaking plea, quote, "Please don't hurt me." But the revelations didn't stop with the inmate's testimony. As the retrial unfolded, Billy Green, in a stunning twist, turned the tables and testified against his own son, Chad. During the trial, Billy recounted a conversation he had with Chad days after the slayings. The two were driving back to their home in Warm Springs from a convenience store when Billy asked Chad if he had killed the Elliott family. Chad, with tears streaming down his face, admitted to the murders. He explained that on the night of the killings, he had driven to the 11-Point River, but his truck broke down. After walking to Carl's house to ask for help, the situation quickly escalated. According to Billy's testimony, Chad said that an argument had broken out between him and Carl, and during the struggle, Chad had shoved a gun in Carl's face. The gun went off, and Carl was killed instantly. Afterward, Chad rolled Carl's body into the river and returned to the Elliott house to finish what he had started. He murdered Lisa and Gregory Elliott before taking Felicia, wrapping her in a rug, and placing her in the trunk of the car. But the horror didn't end there. Billy claimed that after they had driven away, Chad carried the little girl through a wooded area and into a creek that had flooded during a storm. In the darkness, he murdered Felicia as well. Billy explained that he hadn't originally disclosed his son's confession in 1998 because he feared Chad would be convicted and sentenced to death. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that there was no concrete evidence to pin the murders solely on one person. Investigators had no reliable witnesses, and the DNA evidence was inconclusive, making it impossible to charge just one of the Greens. In the end, Chad Green was sentenced to 4 life sentences in prison for the murders of Carl, Lisa, Gregory, and Felicia Elliott. On top of that, he received an additional 40 years for kidnapping Felicia. In an unrelated case, Chad was also convicted of assaulting 2 young girls and received another 56 years for those crimes. As it turned out, Chad Green had a deeply disturbing reputation within his community. He was known to have a history of being a pedo, making the theory that he had sexually assaulted Felicia prior to the murders all the more chilling. The possibility that Felicia had confided in her father, Carl, about the abuse, and that Carl had been planning to go to the sheriff, painted a dark and twisted picture of the motivations behind the murders. This explains why Chad decided to eliminate everyone. Billy Green, too, could not escape the consequences of his involvement in these horrific acts. He was sentenced to 4 life sentences for the murders of Carl, Lisa, Gregory, and Felicia Elliott. On top of that, he received an additional 40 years for his role in the kidnapping of Felicia. However, due to the circumstantial nature of the case, with no solid physical evidence directly linking him to the killings, the death penalty was taken off the table. The lack of irrefutable evidence meant that Billy would spend the rest of his life behind bars, but the justice system could not offer the finality that many hoped for. Today, both Billy and Chad Green are serving their life sentences at the Arkansas Department of Corrections, where they will remain for the rest of their lives. The tragic Elliott family was laid to rest together at the Gravesville Cemetery in Dalton, Arkansas, their lives forever cut short by the brutal actions of 2 men. As much as this case was full of confusion, twists, and finger-pointing, one thing is clear. Both Billy and Chad played significant roles in the horrifying deaths of the Elliott family. While the true extent of each person's responsibility may never be fully understood, the judge and jury made a decisive move by handing down identical sentences for both father and son, ensuring that justice was served in the only way it could be. Case 2. Samuel McDowell, also known as Samuel Little, showed no remorse as he proudly described how he murdered his first victim in 1971. And then there was no stopping him from hunting down helpless women who fall under the category of the less dead people. From 1971 to 2005, this man would pursue, kill vulnerable women from one state to another, and get away with at least a haunting number of 93 murders over a period of several decades. A pure evil who does not show a hint of remorse through his expressions, Samuel Little was rather proud of his murder confessions. On June 7, 1940, a prostitute gave birth to a child who would ruthlessly kill women from her profession. The most prolific murderer in the history of the USA was born in the small town of Reynolds, Georgia. This town had a population of about 1,000. Most of the town residents lived below the poverty line. Samuel was an unwanted child since the day he arrived in this world. At one point, his mother abandoned him on the side of the road, so she could get away with the expenses of raising a child. He saw his mother selling herself at night and called her the Lady of the Night in one of his confessions. Since his early childhood days, Samuel saw how the poorest of people worked to earn money. He had quite a distant relationship with his mother, who would think of him as an additional expense and not a son. But Samuel was not completely abandoned by his family. His grandmother decided to take responsibility for his expenditures and gave him a place in her house in Lorain, Ohio. Samuel attended Hawthorne Junior High School, but quickly dropped out due to poor grades and even poorer behavior. He was, however, good at art and boxing, which came in handy later in life when he viciously took the lives of innocent women. After dropping out of school, he would choose a path that would drive him to commit crimes. Samuel would get addicted to breaking the law, which would land him in prison over 100 times. In 1956, at the young age of 16, Samuel was convicted of breaking and entering. He was sent to a juvenile detention center and released shortly. About 5 years later, he was once again caught breaking and entering a Lorain furniture store. This time he was sent to an adult prison for some time. Samuel's list of crimes increased as he got older. He was arrested about 26 times in 11 different states by the time he reached 35 years of age. This man had quite a clear vision of what he wanted in life, and it clearly did not involve abiding by the law. Samuel had a long list of crimes that did not involve murder yet. Assault, theft, DUIs, fraud, solicitation, armed robbery, breaking and entering, aggravated assault on a police officer, shoplifting, and many more crimes that Samuel would commit throughout his life before finally getting sentenced to life in prison. While he is getting caught, convicted, and released, nobody in law enforcement has realized that this man is killing women from one U.S. state to another. By 1975, he had been across 11 states for almost every crime that you have heard of, and even attacking government officials. And yet, he always managed to walk free. Then came 1982. Little was arrested in Pascagoula, Mississippi, for the murder of 22-year-old Melinda Rose Lepre, who had gone missing that September. It seemed like the law had finally caught up with him, but no. A grand jury refused to indict him, and just like that, he was off the hook. Before investigators could do anything else, Little was shipped off to Florida, where he was tried for the murder of 26-year-old Patricia and Mount. Witnesses said they had seen him with Mount the night before she disappeared, but the jury didn't trust their testimonies. Once again, he walked free in January 1984. After that, Little moved to California and wasted no time finding new victims. In October 1984, he kidnapped, beat, and strangled 22-year-old Lori Barros in San Diego. She survived. A month later, police found him in the back seat of his car with another woman, beaten, unconscious, and barely alive. She had been left in the same area where he had attacked Barros. This time, he was sentenced to just 2.5 years in prison, and the moment he got out in February 1987, he went straight to Los Angeles and murdered at least 10 more women. For years, Little moved from place to place, leaving behind a trail of victims while staying just out of reach of the law. All that changed on September 5, 2012. Police found him at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky, and arrested him on a narcotics charge. It seemed like a small offense, but little did they know, a DNA test will change everything moving forward. The results linked him to 3 cold cases from the 1980s: Linda Alford, killed in July 1987, Guadalupe Duarte Apodaca, killed in September of the same year, and Audrey Nelson Everett, killed in August 2 years later. All 3 had been strangled and dumped on the streets of Los Angeles. That arrest opened the floodgates, and the water came drowning the law enforcement authorities. Investigators soon tied him to more than 30 other murders from the same time period. The case of Melinda Lepre in Mississippi was reopened, and the deeper police dug, the worse it got. Eventually, Little admitted to killing 93 women across multiple states, making him the deadliest serial killer in U.S. history. For years he had gone unnoticed, preying on women society had overlooked. But in the end, his past caught up with him, and this time, there was no escaping justice. By September 2014, nearly 2 years later after he was caught on a narcotics charge, Samuel Little was finally on trial for the murders of Linda Alford, Audrey Nelson Everett, and Guadalupe Duarte Apodaca. The prosecution had rock-solid DNA evidence, plus testimony from survivors who had barely escaped his attacks over the years. On September 25, 2014, the verdict came down. Samuel Little was found guilty. Little was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. But even then, he refused to admit what he had done, insisting he was innocent. He was locked up at California State Prison in Los Angeles County. But that was far from the end of his story. For decades, law enforcement suspected that Little had killed far more people than they could prove. Then, in November of 2018, everything changed. Out of nowhere, he confessed to strangling Melissa Thomas in 1996. A few days later, he admitted to killing Denise Christie Brothers in 1994. That confession led to another trial in Texas, where he pleaded guilty and picked up another life sentence. But he wasn't done talking. Over the next few weeks, Little started spilling details about dozens of other murders. Investigators were stunned as he confessed to more than 90 killings across 14 states, spanning from 1970 to 2005. He looked in the eyes of the officers as he admitted to these crimes, making fun of the authorities who failed to catch him as he put the vulnerable through extreme suffering before finally taking their lives. His memory was terrifyingly sharp. He could describe victims in detail, recall where he had picked them up, and even explain how he had disposed of their bodies. He admitted to killing of Brenda Alexander in Alabama, Fredonia Smith in Georgia, Dorothy Richards and Daisy McGuire in Louisiana, Julia Critchfield in Mississippi. He had claimed to dump her body off a cliff. Nancy Carol Stevens in Mississippi, Evelyn Weston in South Carolina, Rosie Hill in Florida. And those were just the ones confirmed in November of 2018. Little wasn't just talking, he was drawing. From his prison cell, he sketched portraits of his victims, capturing their faces with haunting accuracy. The FBI released these drawings, hoping to match them to real missing persons and unsolved cases. And it worked. At least one of his sketches helped solve a cold case in Ohio. The confessions kept coming, and they would not stop until the death of this monster. In December 2018, he was indicted for the 1981 murder of Linda Sue Boards in Kentucky. That same month, a Tennessee victim from 1975 was finally identified as Martha Cunningham. Then in 2019, he was linked to even more killings in Ohio, including Mary Jo Payton and Rose Evans in Cleveland. A woman found in Near I, 271 in Ohio. He couldn't remember her name. A victim in Akron, 2 women in Cincinnati. One was Anna Stewart, last seen visiting her sister in the hospital in 1981. A woman he met in Columbus and dumped in Kentucky. By June 2019, he had been officially indicted for multiple Ohio murders. Little's confessions didn't just close cold cases, they also freed innocent people. In November 2020, he admitted to 2 Florida murders, including one where someone else had been wrongfully convicted. Even after his death in December 2020, his crimes were still being uncovered. In 2022, authorities identified Zena Marie Jones, one of his Memphis victims from the 90s. In the end, Samuel Little confessed to so many murders that were more than any other known serial killer in American history. Many of his victims were women society had ignored, sex workers, runaways, women struggling with addiction. They had been forgotten, their cases left unsolved for decades. But in his final years, Little gave them back their names. He told their stories. And though justice came far too late for most of them, their families finally got the answers they had been waiting for. Here are some of the stories, in his own filthy words, that Little told about the victims he claimed were less dead. Location 1. Miami, Florida. Victim 1. Marianne. Marianne was a young and attractive teenage transgender black woman. According to Samuel Little, she was around 140 pounds and between 5 feet 6 inches to 5 feet 7 inches tall. In 1971, the two met at a bar called Pool Palace in Miami, Florida. They talked for a while and hit it off immediately. A few days later, they crossed paths again at another bar in Overtown. This time, Little offered Marianne a ride home, and she accepted without hesitation. Upon arriving at her residence, one of Marianne's roommates asked Little to buy shaving cream. Taking advantage of the moment, he lured Marianne back into his car, under the pretense of running the errand. Once on Highway 27, he reached over and wrapped his hands around her throat, tightening his grip until she was lifeless. Without remorse, he drove to a remote dirt road leading to a river, where he discarded her body into the thick, muddy waters. Then, as if nothing had happened, he returned to his life, unbothered and unnoticed. Victim 2. Unknown woman. Little's second victim in Florida, murdered in 71 or 72, was another black woman. He described her with brutal disdain, calling her ugly, dark-skinned, short, and stiff. He believed she worked as a prostitute. After picking her up, he drove to the woods near military property, where he smothered her to death before abandoning her body among the trees, assuming someone would eventually discover it. Victim 3. Emily. In the mid-70s, Little took the life of a young black prostitute, whom he recalls as Emily. He remembered her as having big legs and a pretty face. She carried a University of Miami student ID, reinforcing his belief that she worked as a prostitute. After luring Emily into his car, he drove down a highway toward a secluded dirt road. A fight broke out between them, and Emily fought back, throwing punches at him. Enraged, Little overpowered her, beating her to death before dragging her lifeless body to a garbage pile and concealing it beneath a mattress. He even recalled seeing a man watching from a distance. But, as always, he walked away without consequence. Victim 4. Unknown woman. A 28-year-old black woman, dark-skinned and well-built, crossed paths with Little 2 years after he had known her family. He and his girlfriend, Jean, had sold clothes to them on Nelson Street. When he ran into her at a liquor store, she was complaining about her husband's mistreatment. Seizing the opportunity, Little offered her comfort and a ride. And then, he strangled her and abandoned her body in the thick grass, leaving her to be swallowed by the elements. Victim 5. Unknown woman. In 1977 or 1978, Little met a chubby black woman dancing at a bar. She was wearing shorts that night, but later changed into a skirt at her house before they left together. Her siblings, familiar with Little, called him Sam. After she rejoined him outside, he told her they were going to Lakeland. Instead, he drove toward the dark woods near the railroad tracks, where he strangled her to death. He kept her underwear as a twisted trophy before discarding her body in the open wilderness. Location 2. North Little Rock, Arkansas. Victim 1. Ruth. On a frigid, snowy day in North Little Rock, Arkansas, Little encountered another black woman, approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, whom he believes was named Ruth. They spent 3 days together before he was arrested for shoplifting. Upon his release 3 hours later, he returned to his car, where Ruth was asleep in the passenger seat. They drove around, meeting her ex-boyfriend before eventually heading back to her place. The following day, Little drove Ruth down a dirt road, determined to make her his next victim. He strangled her manually, then abandoned her lifeless body near a cornfield. Location 3. California. Victim 1. Unknown woman. In 1987, in Los Angeles, Little entered a drug dealer's house and spotted a black woman wearing shorts. The dealer, also her pimp, ordered her to leave with Little. After purchasing drugs, they entered an abandoned house with a garage cluttered with wood planks, paint cans, and sawhorses. They climbed onto a ledge inside the garage, but as Little's sick urges consumed him, he wrapped his hands around her throat. The young woman fought desperately, and in their struggle, they fell off the ledge. But Little's grip remained firm. He choked her to death. Weeks later, when he drove by, the crime scene was taped off, and soon after the entire structure was demolished. Location 4. California. Victim 2. Unknown woman. Later, still in California, Little met another black woman wearing a mini dress at a motel near Tam's Burgers in Los Angeles. He contemptuously called her a crackhead. Exploiting her drug addiction, he lured her into his car. He parked near thick vegetation by a laundromat, where she climbed into the back seat. He followed, wrapped his hands around her throat, and squeezed until she stopped breathing. He later disposed of her body near an iron pipe railing, hanging her lifeless corpse among the thick trees and underbrush, confident that no one would find her. Location 3. Unknown teenage girl. A teenage girl, about 19 years old, became another victim of his monstrosity. She was petite, weighing only 120 pounds, and had a distinctive red bandana around her forehead with tattoos adorning her body. Little met her in Compton, California, and promised her drugs. She trusted him and got into his car. He drove her to the secluded Hollywood Hills, where he suddenly turned violent. The young girl fought for her life with every ounce of her strength, but it was no match for Little's trained fists. When he finally crushed the life out of her, he pulled over by a fence and threw her body down the steep hillside, listening with satisfaction as it tumbled into the darkness. Victim 4. Unknown woman. Another victim met her tragic fate at Little's hands in 1992. She was a black woman wearing a religious turban, light-skinned, and weighed about 200 pounds. Little lured her into his car and drove to his residence before heading to Compton. It was raining when he parked behind a store during a riot. The chaos outside masked her final struggle. She honked, desperately trying to summon help. A Hispanic man noticed, but did nothing. Overpowering her, Little smothered her to death. He placed her lifeless body in the passenger seat to make it look as though she were merely sleeping. Then he drove to a nearby bank branch and pulled her body onto the manicured lawn, leaving her to the mercy of the storm. But despite his staggering body count, he was only officially convicted for 8 murders, cases where DNA and witness testimonies made his guilt undeniable. These victims were just the beginning of Little retelling the tales of his monstrosity. Some names he remembered, while some he had long forgotten. However, he still recalled the eerie details of his victims' weight and height, even remembering their facial features. The list would go on to complete the horrific number of 93. While he admitted to the murders, Samuel Little also began to share the details of his personal life during the years he killed innocent women left and right. Little had a longtime girlfriend, Dorsey, who stuck by his side, even helping him evade conviction in a 1972 robbery case. Their relationship wasn't built on love in any conventional sense. It thrived in the shadows of crime, a partnership rooted in deception and survival. But Dorsey, like so many in Little's circle, didn't get a happy ending. She died of a brain hemorrhage in 1988, leaving him to continue his dark work alone. Even in death, Little remained an enigma. On December 30th, 2020, he passed away in a Los Angeles County hospital. Officially, there was no cause of death listed, but given his failing health, diabetes, heart problems, and a body worn down by time, his end was inevitable. Unlike his victims who were discarded like afterthoughts, he slipped away peacefully, a privilege he never granted them. But death didn't grant him an escape from being the infamous monster that he was. His crimes and confessions became the subject of books, interviews, and documentaries. Author Gillian Loren sat across from him for more than 40 hours, listening as he relived his horrors, sketching the faces of women whose names had long been forgotten. She had started with the intention of writing a crime novel, but her path took a sharp turn when she learned about him from LAPD Detective Mitzi Roberts. What began as fiction turned into a brutal, undeniable reality. Lauren's work led to the Haunting Stars docuseries confronting a serial killer and her book Behold the Monster, both peeling back the layers of Little's twisted existence. Through her efforts, the world saw not just the killer, but the failures of a system that let him keep killing for over 40 years. His victims weren't just statistics, they were people, ignored because of their race, lifestyle, or circumstances. Society had forgotten them, but Little hadn't. He remembered every detail. In the end, Samuel Little died as he lived in his own world, his own twisted mind, painting the faces of the women he murdered. He never showed remorse, never feared justice. He saw himself as untouchable, a predator who played by his own rules. But history will remember him differently, not as a mastermind or a legend, but as a killer with no remorse who thrived on society's indifference. And while his body rests in a grave somewhere, his victims still speak, through their families, through investigators, and through the stories now told to ensure that monsters like him don't go unnoticed again. His story is a harrowing reminder of the victims society often overlooks, the ones whose disappearances go unnoticed, whose names fade without justice. Case 3. Kendrick Johnson was born in October 1995 to Kenneth and Jacqueline Johnson. As the youngest of his siblings, he was the heart of his family, the light that filled their home. His mother described him as the joy of their lives, a boy with an easy smile and a natural charm. He was fiercely athletic, a rising star in both football and basketball. Science and math came easily to him, and he had a gift for numbers, effortlessly keeping track of allowances in his head. But above all, Kendrick had dreams, big, unstoppable dreams of making it as a professional football player. However, on January 11, 2013, those dreams were silenced forever. 17-year-old Kendrick was discovered in a way no one could have imagined. His lifeless body twisted unnaturally inside a rolled-up wrestling mat in the gymnasium of Lowndes High School, also known as LHS in Valdosta, Georgia. His feet stuck out from the top, his head buried deep within the coil, as though the mat itself had swallowed him whole. It was a grotesque, baffling sight. Authorities were quick to explain it away. The Lowndes County Sheriff's Office ruled his death an accident, claiming Kendrick had fallen inside the mat while reaching for a pair of sneakers. The Georgia Bureau of Investigations, also known as GBI, conducted an autopsy, concluding his death was due to positional asphyxia. He had suffocated, trapped upside down, but his parents, Jackie and Kenneth Johnson, knew better. Something was wrong. And then, the horrifying details began to emerge. January 9th, 2013. The first day back at school after the Christmas break. The students of LHS settled into routine. The school had 2 gymnasiums, an old one and a newer, larger one. In the dim, dusty corner of the old gym stood several large wrestling mats, rolled tightly and stacked upright. Some students, including Kendrick, stored personal belongings inside the mats to avoid paying locker fees. But over the break, more mats had been added, shifting the arrangement. LHS followed a block schedule, meaning classes alternated on different days. On Thursday, January 10th, at exactly 1:30 p.m., grainy surveillance footage captured Kendrick walking into the old gym. However, he was never seen leaving. His next class was weightlifting, but he never arrived. Hours passed. The hallways emptied. The school day ended. He was supposed to come home after a freshman basketball game that evening, but he never did. Calls to his phone rang endlessly into silence. Midnight came. Jackie Johnson, his mother, could feel it in her bones. Something was terribly wrong. So, just like any mother would do, she reported him missing. The next morning, January 11th, Jackie Johnson arrived at the school, her heart pounding with dread. She pleaded with administrators, who printed missing person flyers. Time stretched unbearably thin. Then, at approximately 10:30 a.m., inside the old gym, a group of female students sat on the top of the wrestling mats, filling out surveys. They chatted absently when something caught their attention. A pair of socks, barely visible, peeking out from one of the rolled-up mats. One girl laughed, thinking it was a prank, but curiosity took the best of her. She climbed onto the bleachers, peering down into the mat, and what she saw sent ice through her veins. A body. The laughter stopped. The air grew thick. Her scream broke the stillness of the gym. A male student rushed over, his hands trembling as he tried to pull Kendrick out. The moment he touched the body, he recoiled in horror. The stench of decomposition hit like a wave. It was clear that something terrible had happened here. A teacher sprinted forward. Together, they knocked the mat over. Kendrick's body slumped forward, his face unrecognizable, grotesquely swollen, his eyes frozen in a scream that never left his lips. The school erupted into chaos. Administrators ordered a lockdown. Students were ushered into the new gym, away from the nightmare unfolding in the old one. Somewhere in the chaos, Jackie Johnson's world was shattering. A voice delivered the words that would change her life forever. His body had been found. Kendrick had been there for 21 hours, alone, suffocating in the dark. For Jackie and Kenneth Johnson, grief turned to horror when their son's body was exhumed for a second autopsy. Because as it turns out, his organs were missing. Every single one. Heart, lungs, liver, brain gone. In their place, his body had been crudely stuffed with newspaper. A grotesque mockery of justice. The second autopsy revealed blunt force trauma, a direct contradiction to the official ruling of asphyxia. This will be explained later in the video. Someone had hurt Kendrick. Someone had covered it up. And yet, the questions surrounding his death remain unanswered. Was Kendrick Johnson the victim of a tragic accident? Or had he been silenced? Murdered? Hidden? Erased? 10 years later, the truth remains buried. But one thing is certain. Somewhere, someone knows what really happened. Lowndes County authorities moved quickly, questioning every student in the gym at the time Kendrick was found. Their stories aligned. A video was taken of the scene, capturing the eerie stillness of the gym, the blood pooling beneath Kendrick's head, the 2 pairs of shoes, one near his feet, the other beneath him. But something felt off. No blood was found outside the mat. None on the yellow folder or schoolbook Kendrick had been carrying. None on the shoes he had been wearing. Old blood was discovered on a nearby column, but tests confirmed it didn't belong to Kendrick. In the girls' bathroom trash can, bloody tissues were found, which were traced back to a female student who had suffered a nosebleed. Yet, Kendrick's socks were partially pulled off, his body twisted in a way that defied simple explanation. The Johnson family refused to accept the ruling of accidental death. They sought help from civil rights organizations. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also known as SCLC, and the NAACP stepped in. Protests erupted. Kendrick's parents were even arrested for civil disobedience outside the courthouse. The case was becoming larger than life. A battle against what they believed was a cover-up. With mounting pressure, the Department of Justice stepped in, launching its own investigation. But even that led to dead ends. Allegations swirled about 2 brothers, Brian and Brandon Bell, whose father was an FBI agent. The Johnsons publicly accused them, fueling further controversy. But an airtight alibi placed one of the boys out of state at the time of Kendrick's disappearance. The case grew murkier. The SCLC and NAACP, once Kendrick's biggest advocates, turned away after their own investigations concluded that his death was, in fact, an accident. But his parents refused to accept that answer. Was Kendrick Johnson the victim of a tragic accident? Or was his death covered up to protect someone? This case remains a mystery. Two sides of a coin, each telling a different story. Kendrick Johnson was no stranger to the old gym at Lowndes High School. Like many students, he used the rolled-up wrestling mats as makeshift storage, tucking his shared pair of sneakers inside to avoid locker fees. It was a habit, one he had done countless times before. On January 10, 2013, surveillance cameras captured Kendrick walking into the gym alone. No one followed him. No one saw what happened next. But based on the physical evidence, investigators believe Kendrick's final moments unfolded in a tragic sequence of miscalculated movements. Standing at 5 feet 10 inches, Kendrick reached for the mat containing his shoes, only to realize it had been repositioned over the holiday break, now wedged behind several others. The opening was just out of reach. Rather than tipping the mat over, a noisy act that might have drawn unwanted attention, he did what he had likely done before. He climbed in. Gripping the side of the mat with his right hand, he lowered himself in head first, stretching out his left hand to grab the shoe inside. But as he descended deeper, the confined space left him with no room to bend his elbow and pull himself back up. His muscles strained. Panic set in. At some point, he lost his grip on the mat's edge and slid further down, his body now fully inverted, his shoulders wedged against the walls of the mat, trapping him. The more he struggled, the more gravity worked against him, constricting his movements. He tried to shift his weight, maybe even attempted to kick himself free. In doing so, he dislodged the shoes he had been wearing, sending them tumbling down near his feet. Blood rushed to his head. The world around him grew darker. Oxygen levels plummeted as his lungs compressed under his own weight. Trapped and helpless, he suffocated in silence, alone in a gym full of students, just beyond the reach of rescue. For nearly 21 hours, Kendrick remained inside the mat, unnoticed. Kendrick's absence went unquestioned until his mother reported him missing, but by then, it was too late. When his body was finally discovered the next morning, rigor mortis had already set in. The official ruling: accidental positional asphyxia, a misjudged decision that turned deadly in the blink of an eye. Positional asphyxia is a silent, insidious killer. It occurs when a person's body becomes trapped in a position that restricts their breathing, cutting off the oxygen supply until they suffocate. Unlike the dramatic struggle often associated with suffocation, positional asphyxia is a slow, agonizing death, one where the victim may not even realize they are in danger until it's too late. This condition typically happens when someone is unable to free themselves from a confined space, like being wedged between furniture, trapped in a car, or, as in Kendrick Johnson's case, found upside down inside a rolled-up gym mat. When the body is contorted in a way that compresses the chest or prevents the lungs from fully expanding, every breath becomes shallower, the oxygen levels drop, and eventually unconsciousness sets in. If help doesn't arrive in time, death is inevitable. Medical findings from other positional asphyxia cases reveal strikingly similar patterns. Victims are often discovered in unnatural positions with signs of suffocation, such as blood oozing from the mouth and nose, darkened or discolored skin, and fluid accumulation in the lungs. But what makes these deaths so haunting is how easily they can be mistaken for something else. But the coin had another side. Kendrick Johnson was found dead, upside down in a rolled-up gym mat. That much is fact. But to his family, nothing else about the official story makes sense. From the moment his body was discovered, the Johnsons have insisted that Kendrick didn't climb into the mat on his own. He didn't fall, he didn't suffocate by accident. He was killed, and what followed was a cover-up so deliberate, so intricate, that even years later, the truth remains buried. From the very start, things didn't add up. The most glaring red flag was the way the case was handled. The coroner, whose job it was to oversee the body and crime scene, was not called for nearly 6 hours, which is an outright violation of Georgia law. By the time he arrived, the gym was no longer secured, and whatever evidence had been there was already compromised. When Lowndes County authorities ruled Kendrick's death an accident, they did so with astonishing speed. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation's medical examiner signed off on positional asphyxia as the cause of death. dismissing any possibility of foul play. The case was closed, but the Johnsons weren't convinced. Because something happened inside that gym, something far darker than an accident. The position of Kendrick's body also raised questions. His arms were in unnatural positions. One stretched above his head, the other bent at his side. If he had been reaching for his shoes, both arms should have been extended downward. The gym mats were stacked in a way that made it impossible for him to have fallen in accidentally. And if he had managed to climb inside, how did his shoes end up neatly placed on top of his legs rather than beneath him? There was also blood, enough to cause alarm. A streak of blood was found on a nearby wall, and a pool of blood was seen under his head. Yet authorities never tested it, dismissing it as old and unrelated to the case. And of course, as we already know, there were his organs. Months later, Kendrick's parents made the painful decision to exhume his body for an independent autopsy, desperate for answers they felt had been withheld. When the body was examined, what they found was horrifying. His internal organs were missing, replaced with newspaper. While officials later claimed this was standard procedure due to decomposition, it only added to the family's growing suspicions. The independent autopsy brought even more troubling findings. While the Georgia Bureau of Investigation had ruled Kendrick's death an accident due to positional asphyxiation, this new autopsy pointed to a much more violent end. It revealed clear signs of blunt force trauma to the neck, evidence that Kendrick had not suffocated, but had been struck with enough force to kill him. Two separate autopsies, two completely different conclusions. Which one was telling the truth? The funeral home insisted they received his body that way. The coroner's office denied any involvement. No one could explain it, or no one would. Perhaps most chilling was how long it took for authorities to notify the Johnsons about their son's death. Kendrick's body was discovered in the morning, but his family was not informed until much later. As they pleaded for answers, law enforcement remained indifferent, offering only vague explanations. Kendrick's parents believed they knew who was responsible. The Johnsons did not believe their son's death was an accident. They were convinced he had been murdered, and they believed they knew who was responsible. Their lawsuit pointed to two brothers, Brian and Brandon Bell, who also attended Lowndes High School. They alleged that one of the brothers had lured Kendrick to the gym, where he was brutally attacked under the orders of their father, an FBI agent. The motive, according to the lawsuit, stemmed from an altercation over a girl. The Bell family, however, denied any involvement. School records showed that one of the brothers was out of town on the day Kendrick was last seen alive, while the other was reportedly in another part of the school. Authorities used this as proof that the brothers had airtight alibis, but the Johnsons remained unconvinced, arguing that the evidence had been manipulated to protect the family. And the accusations didn't stop. The answers might have been there. They might have been captured by the silent, unblinking eyes of the surveillance cameras stationed inside Lowndes High School's old gym, the very place where Kendrick Johnson was found dead. But those answers? They are missing. When forensic video analyst Grant Fredericks examined the school's surveillance footage, he found something deeply unsettling. It wasn't just a question of what the cameras had captured. It was a question of what they hadn't. An entire hour and 5 minutes were missing from two cameras inside the gym, time that included Kendrick's final moments. Two other cameras had lost even more, a staggering 2 hours and 10 minutes of footage. Then, at precisely 1:09 p.m., the video resumes, just in time to show Kendrick entering the gym. But what happened before that? Who was already inside? We don't know, because that footage, the most critical piece of evidence in the entire case, is simply gone. Even more suspicious was the discovery that the timestamps on the cameras didn't match. The cameras inside the gym appeared to be running 10 minutes ahead of the ones outside, creating a fractured timeline, one that could easily be manipulated. A camera outside the gym did capture something important. In the missing hour of footage, numerous students walked into the gym. Did they see anything? Were they questioned? Or were they part of something that had to be hidden? The deeper Fredericks dug into the video files, the more alarming his findings became. Some of the recordings were corrupted, rendering them unplayable. Others had been processed incorrectly, leading to significant image loss. I can't say why they were done that way, he admitted, but they were not done correctly, and they were not done thoroughly. What should have been a clear, indisputable account of Kendrick's final moments was instead a digital void, empty spaces where the truth should have been. What made it worse was the chain of custody, or rather the complete failure of it. Law enforcement had not immediately taken control of the video system themselves. Instead, they had left it up to the school's IT department to decide what footage to turn over. Fredericks warned that you don't want somebody who might be party to the responsibility to make the decision as to what they provide the police. And yet, that's exactly what happened. A school employee, not an investigator, had extracted the footage. It was then handed over to police 5 days after Kendrick's body was found. By then, anything could have been altered, deleted, or replaced. Fredericks' conclusion was chilling. Until I have the digital video system in my hand, and I can say everything is intact, and this is what was recorded, I would still be highly suspicious of this. Somewhere in those missing minutes, in those corrupted files, in those altered timestamps, somewhere in the digital abyss, lies the truth about what happened to Kendrick Johnson. But if the truth was captured on camera, someone made sure we'd never see it. Why were so many leads left unexplored? Why were the bells seemingly above scrutiny? The Johnsons believed it was because of their father's powerful connections. As the Johnsons pushed for answers, law enforcement remained firm in their stance. Kendrick's death was an accident. When the family accused the sheriff's office and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation of mishandling the case, officials dismissed the allegations as baseless. Despite this, disturbing details continued to surface. A coroner's report described the handling of the case as very poor and noted that the body had been moved before officials arrived. A sealed body bag had been tampered with. Authorities refused to fully cooperate. Determined to uncover the truth in 2015, the Johnsons filed a lawsuit naming not just the Bell brothers, but over 30 defendants, including law enforcement officers, school officials, and medical examiners. They accused the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office of staging the scene, placing Kendrick's body inside the mat to make it look like an accident. But their case fell apart. No eyewitnesses, no hard evidence, no confession. And yet, questions lingered. Investigators, however, stood firm. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation dismissed claims of homicide, citing a regional crime lab report that found no significant injuries on Kendrick's body. But then came the independent autopsy. Dr. William Anderson, a forensic pathologist hired by the Johnsons, concluded Kendrick had died from blunt force trauma to the neck, not suffocation. He ruled it a homicide, 2 autopsies, 2 conflicting causes of death. Which one was the truth? The Johnsons have spent over a decade fighting for answers. They've filed lawsuits, staged protests, called out the corruption they believe runs deep in Valdosta, Georgia. We live here. We know how this town is. We know how they will lie. We know how they will cover up for one another, Kendrick's father, Kenneth Johnson, has said. They exhumed Kendrick's body twice, desperate for new evidence. The parents have spent thousands of dollars trying to expose the truth. But every time they get close, the case slips further into darkness. The Justice Department launched a federal investigation, but never revealed its findings. The courts dismissed key lawsuits, ruling there was not enough evidence. The media moved on. The town moved on. But Kendrick's parents never will, because they believe, they know, that their son was murdered, and that someone somewhere is hiding the truth. The truth remains buried, but the fight for justice is far from over. So what was it? A tragic accident or a carefully concealed murder? To this day, there are no definitive answers. Not for those who have followed this case, and certainly not for Kendrick Johnson's family. Years have passed, but the truth remains just out of reach, lost in missing footage, conflicting reports, and whispers of a cover-up. Justice remains elusive, and the silence surrounding Kendrick's death is louder than ever. Case 4. One of the most horrifying cases we've seen this year involved a little girl and her uncle who didn't just have evil intentions involving her, but wanted a whole village to see exactly what he did. What's even worse than that is not only was he able to avoid prosecution for a while, he, along with many other people, were trying to hunt down this little girl's mother simply for seeking justice for her. Heaven Awat was a 7-year-old girl living in Ethiopia. She is sometimes referred to as Faven, but the general meaning is still the same. Radiance, light, and blessing. Although the date of her birth is unclear, it's been reported that she was born in September of 2016. Heaven also had a sister who was about 4 years younger than her. Her mother, Abekula Shediva, was a nurse. On days that she had to work, she often left her daughter in the care of relatives. When Abekula would come home after her shifts, Heaven scurried to give her mother a big hug. It was the highlight of her day. During her short life, Heaven became very familiar with the concept of war and its consequences on everyday people. Tigray region of Ethiopia was the center of military conflict. On one side was the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, which was essentially the federal government. The other was the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which has been described as an ethnic nationalist paramilitary group and officially classified as a terrorist organization by multiple countries up until 2023 and has been connected to several human rights violations. The conflict was the product of complex tensions going as far back as the 1990s and arguably even further than that. It lasted from 2020 to 2022, with a rebellion in 2023 and further political conflict to this day. As is the case with many other civil wars, the conflict led to destruction in Ethiopia, especially in the Amhara and Tigray regions in the north. Both factions accused the other of war crimes, blockades, famine, and civilian deaths in the thousands. A third of the population had to relocate. It's reported that humanitarian aid was limited to certain parts of Ethiopia, and there still isn't an exact number of casualties from this period. This is obviously a very oversimplified version of a very complicated period of recent history. We bring it up because it does become relevant in the more recent coverage of Heaven's story. For better or worse, Heaven's story is often told through the lens of the conflict's aftermath in an effort to understand why things happened the way they did. Heaven was among many displaced from their homes. Her father, who was a man of Tigray ethnicity, was imprisoned by the federal government. As far as we can tell, the reason as to why was never reported. He may have been actively part of the Liberation Front, or he may have just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Following his release and reportedly feeling unsafe in Amhara, he fled to Tigray. Doing so, he left his family behind, and Beklesh found herself a single mother to 2 young girls. Aside from his absence in his family's life, we don't know much else about Heaven's father. We don't know his name, his age, what he looks like, or what he did for a living. In the grand scheme of things, Heaven's father is a minor figure in today's case. Still, it's hard not to imagine how Heaven's story could have been different if her family had remained intact. While living in the city of Bahir Dar, Heaven and her mother became acquainted with their landlord, Getnet Bea. Beklesh and Heaven were related to Getnet's 15-year-old wife, so the mother felt like they were in a safe environment. There was no indication that Getnet was a dangerous individual. On August 1st, 2023, Beklesh went to work and left her daughters in the care of Getnet's wife, who was their aunt. Heaven excused herself to use the bathroom, and she never came back. The aunt knew something was wrong and went searching for her niece. Maybe she got lost or distracted or went looking for something. No one could have predicted what happened to Heaven during the period she was missing. Getnet Bea had lured Heaven away to an isolated place where he essayed her. He forced sand down her throat so she couldn't scream. By the time it was over, Heaven's muscles were severely damaged from the inside. We will spare you some of the more terrible details, but purely to highlight how evil this man was. It should be noted that his attack on Heaven was so brutal that her spine had partially fallen out of her. The dirt and sand turned into a cement-like paste in her mouth. To cover up his crime, Getnet strangled Heaven. She was so small he only needed to use one hand and his fingertips. He subsequently doused her with a bucket of bleach to wash the blood from her and cut her with a razor. He left her on the front doorsteps under a balcony to make it look like she had fallen. It was a place he knew where she would be seen by not just her family, but by the neighbors as well. In an interview with Yoha Media, Heaven's mother Abekula shared the following. You can only see her spinal cord. Her uterus is gone. She bled. He suffocated her. He used his 5 fingers to strangle her by the throat. His 5 fingers were found on her throat. She bled a lot. He used a bucket to wash her body. After he washed her, he opened the door. Where does he leave her? On the edge of our house where the kids play. The person who discovered Heaven was not a passing bystander, nor was it Heaven's aunt. It was actually Heaven's 3-year-old sister who found her. Heaven was rushed to the Ammon General Hospital and was pronounced dead on arrival. Abekula was held back from seeing her daughter due to the horrifying state that she was in. She called out Heaven's name, hoping in vain for a response. She said everyone was in tears. Doctors, nurses, janitorial staff, and even the security guards. It was clear to the medical professionals that Heaven did not just fall from a balcony. The internal injuries were just too severe to come from a fall, and fell more in line with a violent essay. The bruises and marks on her neck were very clearly from strangulation. Getnet's wife tried to console the grieving mother, and Getnet himself had the nerve to make himself present. His wife cried with Abekula, but he was unemotional. No tears, no words of condolences, no offers to help her through this difficult time. Nothing at all. Getnet tried to sell the idea that Heaven fell from the balcony. By the time Abekula saw heaven for herself, she knew that was impossible. Remember, she was a nurse at the time, so she was no stranger to injuries, no matter how severe. Just like the doctors, she knew that her daughter had been assaulted and disposed of like an object. She believed whoever attacked heaven wanted to leave her someplace where she would be found. They wanted her mother and potentially others to see what was done to her. It didn't take long for police to suspect Getnet, as he was unaccounted for during the time heaven initially went missing. He was arrested by authorities, but escaped a short time later. The police station he was held in was populated with detained members of Amhara militias. The militias organized a break-in to free their allies, and Getnet escaped in the chaos. During this time, he threatened Abekula and her younger daughter with deadly force. They moved around to evade him, and eventually had to go into hiding. Abekula had to leave her nursing job and many further jobs after that out of fear of being found. As most of our viewers are in the US, and if you are, you might have a hard time comprehending this. Because here, a man who brutally murdered a child and escaped prison would be priority number one for sure. Someone capable of this would certainly strike again. However, despite the severe charges against him and the potential danger he posed to other children in the community, Getnet was not a high priority for local law enforcement. Abekulash made every attempt to get her fears taken seriously, but it took roughly a month for Getnet to be returned to police custody. Even after this, Abekulash had to look over her shoulder since his family took it upon themselves to continue threatening her. Following a trial by the High Court of Bahir Dar, Getnet was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The public was outraged, believing the punishment was much too light for such a horrific crime. The Ethiopian Women Lawyers Association were very vocal in their disappointment. They released a public statement which was later quoted by international outlets. The murder by itself should have been enough to sentence him to life imprisonment or to death. It's especially sickening and outrageous when such a horrendous crime is committed against children. However, the High Court in Bahir Dar still thought only 25 years was enough punishment for his crimes because they, and I quote, concluded that the child died as a result of the defendant's violence and strangulation when he raped her because she was too young to withstand the pressure. Now how that quote is supposed to justify Getnet receiving such a light sentence is beyond me. Gogi Tesfaye, who is Ethiopia's Minister of Women, Children and Youth, added her voice to the chorus. She offered her condolences in a post on Facebook and promised to pursue further litigation against Getnet Baya. Her post, translated from Amharic, reads, "In order to protect children's rights and safety in our country, the Minister of Women and Social Affairs is working in coordination with the relevant authorities to save children who are vulnerable due to social problems that are happening in different areas, especially by establishing a system of action to prevent violence against children and to enable them to get the right and comprehensive services to ensure that children's issues are being recorded. The Child Case Management Digital System in cooperation with UNICEF is being made to strengthen the coordination works by extending to Kabyle, which means a ward or neighborhood. On behalf of our ministry and myself, I would like to express our condolences for the horrible inhuman crime that happened regarding the child, Heaven, who was brutally murdered recently. Although the case has been decided, we would like to express that we will work with the judicial authorities and follow up the case. Outrage spread like wildfire as Heaven's story was told. Her name reached international outlets and platforms. She is by far our most requested case outside of the US and the UK. Even Cardi B shared one of 3 Change.org petitions. At the time, 200,000 people signed their names to the petition. There are over 300,000 signatures today. Of the other 2 petitions, one has over 10,000 signatures and the other over 20,000. All 3 are still open to this day and accepting signatures. The petitions not only demanded a harsher sentence for Getnet, but also protection for Heaven's mother. Despite the trial's conclusion, Abekulash was still being threatened by Heaven's aunt and Getnet's family. As Heaven's story spread through petitions, so did word about the light sentence her murderer received. People in the thousands called for a much harsher sentence. Many even wanted to see Getnet executed. These frustrations only grew when he tried to appeal his sentence. His case was said to be adjourned until October of 2024, but there haven't been any updates since August as far as we could find. It should be noted that Ethiopia's legal system allows for the death penalty if the courts see fit. The last person to be executed in Ethiopia was a military major who was convicted for assassinating the former head of security. The major made a formal appeal for clemency to the courts in an attempt to reduce his sentence. His wish was not granted, and he was given the death penalty. It was never reported how he died, but per Ethiopian law, he likely faced a firing squad. Many Ethiopian humanitarians and activists argued that Heaven's mixed ethnicity played a part in her victimhood. They theorized that Getnet believed Heaven to be lesser than or disposable because of her heritage. Getnet still maintains his innocence, so we cannot know for sure if this was a factor at all. At the end of the day, evil is evil, no matter what the motive is. The Ethiopian government was openly criticized due to their inaction in Heaven's case, as well as for the spike in violence against women and girls following the conflict. An editorial piece by Ethiopian magazine, AIDS Standard, called it the cycle of silence. They, among many other organizations, called for change when it comes to cases similar to Heaven's, stating, "What is perhaps most alarming is the apparent inaction of the Ethiopian government in addressing these heinous crimes. Despite widespread documentation by international organizations, human rights groups, and the media, there has been conspicuous lack of effort to investigate, prosecute, and punish those responsible. As a society, we have now reached the level where the impunity enjoyed by perpetrators is not only perpetuating the cycle of sexual violence, but also sending a dangerous message that such crimes are tolerable in times of war and can be expanded outside the context of war without the fear of accountability." This editorial also highlighted a common factor in many true crime cases, one that we often recognize but don't always register immediately. It was Beklesh's efforts, and not those of local law enforcement or government, that put Heaven's story out there. There have been a countless number of cases where family and friends turn to the media or to true crime creators when they believe investigators have neglected their loved ones. While it can sometimes spur law enforcement to increase their efforts, there are times where nothing changes and all continues as usual. For Heaven, it's the latter, even after all the public outrage. If not for her mother's resilience and endurance, the wider world may have never known Heaven A. Watt's name. It took until the trial's initial conclusion for the media to publish her story. Beklesh's efforts were definitely worthwhile. Members of the Ethiopian Women Lawyers Association organized a candlelight vigil at Groove Garden Walk, a public garden space in Meskel Square in Addis Ababa. A crowd in the hundreds came to mourn Heaven, but they were forced to leave. As they arrived in droves, federal law enforcement forced them away from the area, claiming that the crowd was not allowed to be there. But a determined group found another spot to hold their vigil. A video of the vigil was uploaded to TikTok by Bethlehem Tedessa, username Sparklish. She said in the caption, "Yesterday, we gathered at Groove Garden Walk for a candle vigil for Heaven, a moment meant to honor her memory and raise our voices against gender-based violence. Hundreds came, only to be turned away at the door, told it was canceled. But some of us stayed, determined to do what we came for. Dressed in black, with hearts heavy with grief, we were met with disrespect, laughter, loud music, and attempts to silence our pain. But we did not leave defeated. We found a quiet place, a space to mourn, to cry, and to unite. In our tears, we found strength. And in our unity, we built a community that will not be silenced. We formed a WhatsApp group, a space where our voices can be heard, where our pain is acknowledged, and where our fight for justice will continue. We are structuring something strong and resilient, a community of women who will stand together, who will not stop until justice is served. We are here." It's hard to talk about Heaven without discussing the part social media played in her story, especially TikTok. While Heaven's story shocked and saddened many online, others were openly skeptical. They found the mass media coverage overshadowed the Ethiopian government's mistreatment of the Amhara people. These critics believed in a coordinated media plot hell-bent on diverting attention from other current events. Boda Karanyo is a social media content creator and activist focusing on Ethiopian politics. He followed and covered the civil war in Tigray and its aftermath. When he learned of Heaven's case, he used his platform to say his piece. But rather than express his sympathy for the 7-year-old girl and her family, he chose to do the opposite. Because Heaven was born to a father of Tigray ethnicity, Boda said that she deserved what happened to her. Furthermore, he said her mother deserved a similar fate for marrying a man from Tigray ethnicity. It's reported that Boda was already a polarizing, incendiary figure for his community. For some in his audience, and some watching from afar, these remarks were too much. His profile and content was mass reported by TikTok users, which eventually got the attention of moderators. Aside from third-party re-uploads, Boda's content about Heaven and her mother have been removed, including his public apology. It's reported that another content creator in the space made similar remarks, but unlike Boda, he lived in Ethiopia. It's reported he was attacked in the street, allegedly for what he said about heaven. He also apologized for his statements. Take this second story with a grain of salt, because this content creator was unnamed in the articles that mentioned him and his attack. However, it does capture the public consensus about heaven. She was innocent and utterly undeserving of her fate. Some TikTok pages created and spread misinformation about heaven's case. Much of this content was AI generated. TikTok's content policy has rules against certain AI content. One of these rules is the prohibition of AI-generated likenesses of people under the age of 18. Given the platform's algorithm, the misinformation and AI likeness of heaven were spread across TikTok, which only encouraged content replication. Some have been removed, but others still exist on the creators' profiles. More recently, in early March of 2025, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue released their findings from a small-scale study about TikTok's moderation of Amharic posts and comments. It turns out it was easy to bypass the auto-hate speech moderation. All you had to do was make posts in this language. Amharic is a low-resource language, meaning that there are limited resources for engines like automods to learn from. So in this case, this means that despite similar content being flagged when it was written in a European-based language, TikTok's auto-moderation didn't consistently flag inflammatory Amharic posts and comments. It was reported that some of these comments had English translations alongside them, but the existence of the Amharic text alone was enough of a shield to keep them online. This method to bypass automods was used against many Ethiopian activists who told Heaven's story. They faced threats to their lives and safety, similar to the vitriol directed to her mother. Following the backlash from these findings, TikTok announced an advisory council of an Amharic-speaking Ethiopian professor among its members. While these were more than short anecdotes in Heaven's story, TikTok users supported Heaven across the board. Ethiopian equal rights activist Jordan Baziba, one of the many victims of the vitriolic Amharic comments and uploads, was credited with starting the hashtag Justice for Heaven. It received tons of traffic. People mourned, remembered, and shared their thoughts together. So you mean to tell me that that man is going to be receiving a 25-year prison sentence for brutally unaliving and SGNG, that 7-year-old girl? Wow, man. I want to talk to you about a 7-year-old girl named Heaven who was sexually assaulted, mutilated, and killed in Ethiopia. My heart is with Heaven's family and Heaven's mom, who has been seeking justice for her daughter and shedding light on the violence being experienced by women and girls. In Ethiopia, 1 in 3 women experience physical, emotional, or sexual violence, and 65% of women have experienced female genital mutilation. It's the lack of legal ramifications and comprehensive protections for women, and a culture that continues to embolden men to violate the rights of women that has failed Heaven. In the short term, you can support Heaven by signing on to petitions that are being circulated that advocate for a review of the current sentencing that's being given to her assailant. But as we all know, finding justice for Heaven is just the beginning of seeking protections and equality for women and girls. Heaven's case opened the door for Ethiopian women and media outlets to share their own stories of harm and hardship, especially in the context of the nation's conflict and its long-lasting consequences. While their voices had always been present, the attention surrounding Heaven's case brought broader awareness to the ongoing issues in Ethiopia, offering a rare opportunity to be heard on a larger scale. Though Heaven's life ended, her story did not. Her mother, devastated but determined, continued to speak on her behalf even after the trial concluded. She was motivated not only by grief, but also by the responsibility of caring for her younger daughter. As a former healthcare worker, she was heartbreakingly familiar with the suffering of women and girls. "I know there are so many like Heaven," she told reporters. "I can't sleep. I can't forget." She expressed the unimaginable pain of losing a child, especially under tragic circumstances. She was never sick. "I lost my daughter suddenly. It wasn't natural. It was in a terrifying way. She was innocent." She reminisced about the simple joys of motherhood, how her daughter would greet her at the door, especially in the cold months. "Mommy," she'd say, rushing to hug her. "What is happiness if not that?" Even now, she said, she sometimes still expects to see her daughter walk through the door. It's very hard. By late 2024, however, public attention shifted elsewhere. Heaven's mother, Abik Lesh, withdrew from the spotlight, Little is publicly known about her today, and almost nothing about Heaven's father, who never spoke to the media. He may be in hiding, but this remains uncertain. Heaven's sister would be about 5 years old now. Whether she retains memories of that time is unclear. She may not remember the details, but likely carries the emotional impact left behind. We wish peace and healing to both mother and daughter. Heaven's aunt, who is also the wife of the accused, defended her husband publicly and allowed herself to be interviewed. She maintains her belief that Heaven's death was accidental and not the result of wrongdoing. As of 2024, her support remains unchanged, despite public sentiment being largely critical. 2 songs were written in memory of Heaven. One by Zayn Outlander, titled Heaven a What, and another by the Wings music band, titled Galawa. Zayn Outlander, in an interview with Rolling Hype, said, "When I wrote Heaven a What, it wasn't just a song. It was about honoring a life taken too soon and representing those who can no longer speak. I wanted people to feel the story and be moved to act." The Wings music band is a part of Wings Education Media, an Ethiopian organization that promotes access to education, safe expression for children, and the advancement of women and children's rights. Ethiopia's Minister of Women has appeared at their events, and the band recently performed on International Women's Day for public servants and elected officials. As of April 2025, tensions continue in Ethiopia's Tigray region. The neighboring country of Eritrea, which once supported Ethiopia's federal forces during the civil conflict, may now be on the verge of renewed hostilities. If that happens, Tigray could once again become a war zone, and many children may witness their families torn apart, just as Heaven's was. Margaret Douglas was born in Akron, Ohio, on September 15, 1919, to Howard and Margaret Frick. She had 2 sisters, Ida and Ethel, and a brother, Howard Jr. Margaret later married Private Donald H. Douglas, who served in the U.S. Army during World War II. They eventually made their home in a 2-story house on Portage Street in Wadsworth, Ohio. Margaret had a love for gardening and spent many afternoons caring for her flowering bushes. Though she and Donald had no children, they shared a happy life traveling with friends and watching Cleveland Indians games. After Donald passed away in 2000 at the age of 80, Margaret continued to live independently. In the spring of 2018, 98-year-old Margaret was looking forward to her 100th birthday. However, on April 9th, family members grew concerned when they hadn't heard from her in several days. Despite living alone, Margaret remained active in her community and maintained regular contact with her nieces and nephews. After receiving a call from concerned relatives, police in Wadsworth conducted a wellness check. Margaret wasn't found in the house, and initially, there was no clear sign of what had happened. The case was treated as a missing person investigation, and a public appeal was made, sharing a photo of Margaret in her signature pearl earrings and houndstooth blazer. That same night, Margaret's nephew, Howard Leisure, and his wife, Cindy, joined police to search her home. Their worst fears were realized when Howard opened a closet door and discovered Margaret's remains under a pile of clothing. An autopsy was performed by the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner. Although investigators initially weren't sure whether her passing had been from natural causes or something more concerning, certain signs raised suspicions. Reports mentioned that her clothing was in disarray, and visible injuries to her head, face, and neck suggested that she may have been harmed intentionally. It was also noted that she had likely been in the closet for several days before being found. Margaret's tragic passing shocked the community and remains a solemn reminder of the vulnerability of even the most cherished and independent elders. Authorities continued to investigate the circumstances surrounding her death. However, the autopsy revealed that Margaret had no male DNA on her, which came as a surprise to the investigators. She had been robbed, though. Her wallet was missing, along with the $40 cash she had inside of it. But the only clue that the investigators had was a discarded plastic glove that was located in the rear of the home. The police quickly zeroed in on a man named David, who was known to care for the 98-year-old woman, acting as a companion and helping her out with household chores. Although investigators initially were unable to reach him, he ended up turning up the crime scene out of concern for his friend. Police then grew suspicious after David expressed concern that his fingerprints would likely be found inside the home. He was brought in for questioning and provided a DNA sample to be tested against the discarded plastic glove. However, it was not a match for his DNA, and the investigators were right back at square one. According to Sergeant Don Chisminos, he just really cared about Margaret and really had concern that he would have an answer as to what happened. Running out of leads, the investigators began looking into strings of petty crimes in the area, including a trailer at a construction site that had been broken into. Thankfully, whoever committed this crime was dumb enough to leave their phone behind at the scene, and that led the investigators to a young man only known in official documents as Zachary. Now, when they brought in Zachary for questioning, he began to squeal immediately and rolled on his friend, 17-year-old Gavin Ramsey. He admitted that Gavin hadn't been present at the break-in at the construction site, but insisted that he was involved in many other petty crimes in the area. He also claimed, of course, that it was all Gavin's idea. The investigator brought Gavin in for questioning, who was accompanied by his mother, Christine, as he was still a minor at the time. He admitted to petty theft, breaking into vehicles, and after asking his mother to leave the room, he admitted to something else. According to court documents, Gavin would often meet men on dating apps for the purpose of hooking up or simply robbing them, and I quote, that on at least one occasion, he assaulted a man to get him out of the car and indicated that he would routinely take men's cars to get away. When asked about the murder of Margaret Douglas, Gavin claimed that he knew nothing about it. It was until the police started going through his phone. While scrolling through Gavin's photo gallery, the police found numerous photos and videos of Margaret that had been taken from inside of her home without her knowledge. The teenager had somehow snuck into the woman's house and recorded her in secret. The evidence was damning. Realizing that he had been caught, Gavin began to spill his guts, claimed to have snuck into Margaret's Portage Street home simply for thrills and just to record her while she slept. However, when the woman awoke to find Gavin in her bedroom, he claimed that he forced her to the ground and strangled her before he even knew what he was doing, out of fear, if you will. But the damning part was the evidence located on his phone that he did not want to talk about with police. According to Detective Matt Markley of Wadsworth Police Department, he degraded her body, videotaping and taking pictures. He'd actually been in there with her for a while. Now, while I respect Detective Markley's discretion, this was probably the understatement of the decade. After Gavin strangled the life out of poor Margaret, he then proceeded to videotape himself participating in various forms of necrophilia with her corpse. Now, if you've watched our channel for a while, you know we regularly omit some of the more grotesque details like this for a number of reasons. However, we still want to drive the point home about how sick of a human being Gavin is. So we'll tell you a little bit, but for those who really want the full picture, the court documents are readily accessible online. Again, we are heavily redacting the details here. In one video, he pleasured himself with her cold, dead hand. He undressed her body and assaulted her with gloves to avoid leaving DNA. In one picture, Margaret can be seen lying on a couch with Gavin's gloved hand around her throat. In another video, Gavin can be seen dragging Margaret across the carpet. In this video, he posed her body in a suggestive manner. The degradation of Margaret's body went on for approximately 2 hours between 2:09 a.m. and 4:10 a.m. Gavin only left because his parents were about to be up for the day. Gavin Ramsey was arrested and charged as an adult with 9 counts, including 4 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of murder, 1 count of kidnapping, 1 count of aggravated burglary, and 1 count of gross abuse of a corpse. A search of the Ramsey Summit Street home uncovered all of the evidence that the investigators could need. A plastic glove that was a match for the glove found inside of Margaret's home, as well as her missing wallet. Another damning piece of evidence was a journal that the investigators located. This was much more than just your standard teenage angst or edgelord variety type of journal. Gavin had written about fantasies he had involving essay and murder and his apparent love for serial killers. In one entry dated January 19, 2019, he wrote, "I just want to go off on someone and beat them until they're not breathing anymore. I honestly want to take someone's life. I want to know what it would feel like to stand over someone's dead body." According to Sergeant Don Chisminos, after reading those, there was no doubt in my mind that Gavin would kill again if he had the opportunity. This is something he enjoys, that he finds pleasure in. During the course of the investigation, Gavin was seen by Dr. Lynn Luna Jones. Now, Dr. Jones was a board-certified forensic psychologist and the chief psychologist at the Psychodiagnostic Clinic in Akron, Ohio. Gavin shared that he'd been using alcohol, weed, LSD inhalants, and concerta, which can be used to treat ADHD and narcolepsy. He said that in the year leading up to Margaret's murder, he drank alcohol daily, about a fifth of vodka or whatever he could get his hands on. Dr. Jones diagnosed Gavin with a conduct disorder, a sexual sadism disorder, 3 separate disorders with regard to his substance use, and a depressive disorder. She noted that in Gavin's case, recidivism is high and treatment needed to be very, very intense. Dr. Jones noted that Gavin didn't appear to be motivated to change his behavior. She further noted that Gavin was criminally sophisticated and only engaged in crimes, displaying a callous disregard for the harm he causes others. Allegedly, the carjacking and Margaret's murder weren't even Gavin's first incidents of violence. When he was 10 years old, there was already concerns of him becoming a danger to himself and others after he was caught chasing his siblings with knives. At trial, Gavin's mother, Christine Ramsey, tried to claim that the SSRI Zoloft had changed her son for the worse. She blamed the drug for her son's actions, but when she was cross-examined, she admitted that he hadn't started taking the 3 months prior to the murder. She also testified that she's not a doctor and that outside of her intuition, she cannot isolate Zoloft as the sole cause of what her son did. She was also unsure if perhaps the 5th of liquor per day, the weed, the LSD, or the other illicit drugs he was taking could have possibly been the culprit, or that, her kid is a psychopath. After the trial court denied the defense's motion to suppress evidence, Gavin Ramsey pled no contest to the 9 charges against him. He was found guilty on all counts, and following an evidentiary hearing was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole for aggravated murder. He was also sentenced to an additional 10 years for aggravated burglary, 10 years for kidnapping, and 12 months for abuse of a corpse, all of which were to run consecutively to the aggravated murder charge. Gavin attempted to appeal a sentence, but he was unsuccessful in doing so. Now, a lot of people ask us what's the worst case we've ever covered, and our short answer is generally all of them. However, some stories affect us more than others for sure. Margaret's case is one of those cases for me. Now, I spent a lot of my childhood driving back and forth between Maine and Ohio as my Grammy lived in Akron. Much like Margaret, she was fiercely independent and lived alone up until she went into hospice care. While researching this case, I couldn't help but think that this could have been my Grammy. This could have been a lot of people's Grammys regardless of location. I found a little bit of peace at the thought that Gavin was off the streets and couldn't hurt anyone again. But all of that was dashed after I fell down a rabbit hole and came across this next bit of charming information. A petition on change.org sought to change a law that could release violent offenders, such as Gavin Ramsey, from the Ohio justice system. This is due to Ohio Senate Bill 256, which was signed into law by Governor Mike DeWine in 2021. The bill requires all juvenile offenders to be eligible for parole, with the exception of triple murderers. Now, this only applies to the principal offender. So if you're under the age of 18 and are an accomplice in a triple homicide, you're still eligible for parole. If you kill 2 people, you're eligible for parole after 30 years. You kill 1 person, you're eligible after 25 years. Senate Bill 256 also doesn't take into consideration other aggravated circumstances, such as SA, or if the victim is a child, but does everything to make sure that minor offenders will one day walk free. The bill, which was sponsored by Senators Nathan Manning and Peggy Lenner, will allow hundreds of dangerous criminals the chance to go free. This not only includes Gavin Ramsey, but another scumbag who did something very similar to a 94-year-old woman. On March 31, 2015, Marie Bell Castro was murdered in her home by 15-year-old Jacob LaRosa. After attempting to assay the woman, he beat her to death with a metal flashlight. Jacob was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole plus 31 years, but that can all change now. Another example is that of Joshua Wade, who was 16 years old when he shot and killed Titus Arnold in the head with a .40 caliber handgun. Titus was a 23-year-old senior at Urbana University and a youth counselor. After he was shot dead, Joshua Wade and his accomplice, 30-year-old Jason Dean, robbed him of $6. He was killed for $6. His murder concluded a 3-day crime spree, which included robbery and several other victims being shot or almost shot. This included a 1-year-old girl and a pregnant woman. Due to Ohio Senate Bill 256, Joshua will be eligible for parole in 2030 after serving only 25 years of his 56 years to life sentence. However, Stephanie Tengler, who runs the United for Joshua website, had this to share. Those of us who have family members or loved ones serving life sentences they were given as children in Ohio have been working on this for many years. We have encountered major hurdles and setbacks in the process, but have known all along we could never give up on our kids. The signing of this bill means we have hope that someday our loved ones will come home to us, and that those who were told they would die in prison will wake up with a newfound hope in their hearts too. Senator Manning echoed her sentiment, stating, "Passage of this bill is an important step in making Ohio a fair state for all. Thank you to my colleagues in the Ohio legislature, and to those who joined us in working on this legislation to help move Ohio's juvenile justice system forward." According to Preston Shipp of the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth Senior Policy Council, we've seen an incredible uptick in state legislatures banning life without parole for kids, and until now Ohio has been woefully out of step with that national trend toward youth sentencing reform. Children must be held accountable for their actions, but because they are fundamentally different from adults in their ability to assess risk and consequences, and their unique capacity for change, they should be held accountable in age-appropriate ways with a focus on rehabilitation and reintegration into society. Now, I am sure there are examples of people who were convicted as minors that have turned their lives around, and maybe they are truly rehabilitated. I obviously can't sit here and say that there is no case where this bill passing would be a positive. However, on the topic of Gavin Ramsey specifically, it is hard not to feel genuine concern for public safety if someone like him is back on the streets. We would like to remind everyone that Gavin Ramsey was 17 years old when he murdered a 98-year-old woman and engaged in necrophilic acts with her corpse. He was 10 months shy of his 18th birthday at the time of the crime. Is it possible that during that 10 months Gavin would have had some sort of epiphany and become able to resist his violent impulses? I need you to tell me, because I am not a psychologist, so I really need someone qualified to explain this to me. During the course of the investigation, Gavin literally told the detectives that if he hadn't been stopped, that he would probably have killed again, and I am inclined to believe him. Margaret's niece, Cindy Lesher, was interviewed by News 5 Cleveland about the bill, and this is what she had to say. When he was sentenced, it was like, okay, we took A and now you're looking at, here we go. Now he may be back in society at some time. She added, this is not some poor little juvenile that did something and got punished for life. You deserve that. You lost rights when you walked into her house uninvited. No matter where you stand with regard to juvenile sentencing, one can't ignore the fact that this measure is re-victimizing families over and over again each time the person that murdered their loved one is up for parole. As of the date of this recording in April of 2025, the Change.org petition has only garnered 743 signatures. We will have the link to the petition down below, just in case you're interested. Margaret's funeral was held at noon on Saturday, April 21st, 2018 at the Hilliard Rossbert Funeral Home in Wadsworth. 2 days later, she was laid to rest alongside her husband Donald at the Ohio Western Reserve National Cemetery, a military cemetery in Rittman. Her granite headstone is inscribed with the image of a child flanked by a lion and a lamb, which is a reference to Isaiah 11.6. The wolf shall dwell with a lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with a young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. The imagery is symbolic as it pertains to Margaret's story. It depicts a world where natural animosity and conflict are overcome and creatures that are traditionally enemies now live together in peace. Or in Margaret's case, a world where our most vulnerable don't have to live in fear of falling prey to the monsters among us. In close, we'll leave you with a quote from a woman named Cindy that posted to Margaret's obituary page on August 23, 2024. It reads, "When I was a little girl, this woman would actually babysit me. Now I am in my 80s thinking about her, the crafts and games me and her would play. And one day on my 5th birthday, my family and I moved away. I never saw her again, just finding out about her death. I feel too late to help, but she is with God now." Case 6. LaTanya Janelle Carwell, affectionately known as Janelle, was born on April 17, 2001 in Palestine, Texas. Her family relocated to Augusta, Georgia a short time after. From a young age, Janelle exhibited an exceptional sense of responsibility and compassion, especially as the eldest child. The girl's mother, Tanya Faye Tripp, informed loved ones that she had cancer around this time. As a result, she often relied on Janelle for help, a role she embraced with love. At T.W. Josie High School, Janelle was a standout student. She excelled in science and math, subjects that fueled her aspirations to become a nurse and one day a doctor. This career path was deeply tied to her personality. She was nurturing, caring, and always willing to help those in need. Outside of school, she was active in her local church, singing in the choir and participating in community outreach programs. Her passion for music and her role as a leader in her church youth group painted a picture of a teenager with dreams and potential. She was known for mentoring younger students and actively participating in charity drives. For those who knew her, Janelle embodied kindness and determination. She often took on adult responsibilities at home, such as cooking meals and managing household chores. These responsibilities, however, intensified to an unhealthy degree after her mother's new boyfriend entered their lives. Tanya began a relationship with Leon Lamar Tripp when he was behind bars for assault and battery. The career criminal had been incarcerated since June of 2009 and had a very long list of felony convictions, including aggravated assault and aggravated stalking, both of these involving his ex-wife. Despite this, Tanya and Leon wrote romantic letters back and forth, and the two soon began dating. Shortly after his release from jail, they married in 2015. In the beginning, Leon presented himself as a supportive partner and a father figure to his now stepdaughter. However, beneath this veneer lay a dark history of criminal behavior, including convictions for family violence and other offenses that were seemingly ignored. Initially thought to be a loving mother, Tanya's behavior shifted dramatically after her marriage to Leon. Friends and family noted a growing codependence on Leon, even at the expense of her relationship with Janelle. Tanya's willingness to defend Leon over the constant arguing in the home seemed to overrule Janelle's feelings and concerns, almost always. Leon's controlling behavior eventually extended to isolating Tanya from her family and friends. Over time, he managed to influence every aspect of her and her daughter's lives. This dynamic set the stage for the tragedy that was soon to unfold. It didn't take long for friends and even faculty at school to notice the change in Janelle. The once promising student started to show up late to homeroom, became distracted in class, and would often fail to turn in her homework altogether. Janelle also began to withdraw from most of her friends during this period. Janelle, who once had an extremely active social life, began to dwindle. According to her classmates, Janelle was hesitant to talk about her home life, signaling distress that went unnoticed. While her behavior did noticeably change, Janelle managed to maintain the appearance of the average teenager and never let on that anything was seriously wrong. That is until the day of her 16th birthday. On April 18, 2017, Tanya called 911 to report her daughter missing. Tanya later told investigators that hours prior, her husband Leon received a late-night call from a friend asking for help after his vehicle broke down. According to Tanya, that was the last time she saw both Leon and Janelle, as she'd somehow lost all communication with her husband after reporting her daughter missing. These details immediately raised suspicion. Why would a 16-year-old volunteer for such an errand, especially when it was so late at night? And where was Leon? While Tanya's story wasn't exactly adding up, ground and air search teams were deployed to canvass the area surrounding the teen's home in Augusta, Georgia. Tanya quickly took to Facebook Live to stream her grief publicly online. During the Facebook Live video, which was hosted by family friend Pastor Angela Harden, Tanya expressed to her followers that she'd been battling lung and brain cancer. During the stream, she also asked for funds to help to locate her husband and daughter. Meanwhile, local law enforcement coordinated with community volunteers to comb through wooded areas, drainage ditches, and abandoned properties. Helicopters equipped with infrared cameras scanned large swaths of land for any signs of movement or freshly disturbed earth. But still there was no sign of Janelle or her stepfather Leon. In the days that followed, search and rescue dogs were brought in to assist these efforts. However, were hindered by inconsistent information provided by Tanya. In some instances, she stated that Leon and Janelle left willingly, while in others, she expressed uncertainty about Janelle's safety. Her conflicting statements diverted resources and delayed the search's focus on critical locations, only placing more suspicion on both of the teen's parents. During their investigation, authorities learned that in the months leading up to Janelle's disappearance, subtle but alarming changes in the household dynamic were present. Neighbors reported frequent arguments, fits of yelling between Leon and Tanya that were heard coming from the home. Witnesses also reported seeing Leon loading tools into his truck late at night, just hours before Janelle was last seen. A tipster then reached out to Tanya to report a sighting of Janelle, just 2 days after she left with her stepfather. According to the tip, Janelle was seen in Clearwater, South Carolina near Belvedere and Clearwater Road at around 1:30 in the morning. She was carrying a backpack, and when the witness offered her a ride, Janelle declined, explaining that she was waiting to meet someone. One would imagine that this would be pertinent information, but for some reason, Tanya never told the police about this. Other witnesses eventually came forward, informing police that days after Janelle went missing, her stepfather Leon was sighted at a stop-and-shop grocery store in Atlanta, which is about a 2-hour drive west of Augusta. Leon was captured on surveillance at this time as well. However, the footage confirmed that Leon was alone and not accompanied by a 16-year-old girl. Among the friends and family who were interviewed, all seemed to have one thing in common, which were similar reports of Leon's controlling and hostile behavior. Shortly after Leon was sighted in Atlanta, the Richmond County Sheriff's Office released a flyer to the public, and Leon Tripp was officially wanted for kidnapping. Meanwhile, Janelle's mother, Tanya, appeared in multiple news interviews following her daughter's disappearance, expressing concern and pleading for her daughter's return. Talk shows like the Michael Bay's Den Show and the Ricky Smiley Morning Show took interest in Janelle Carwell's case as well, sharing her story and raising awareness about her disappearance. The local news outlet, Channel 6, reported that some people following the case speculated about the potential relationship between Janelle and her stepfather. When this theory was brought up to Tanya, she dismissed it immediately. "He meant to all this prettiness, and he gonna run away with our daughter? Come on now." As weeks turned into months, the search for the missing 16-year-old girl and her stepfather slowly came to a halt. The public was urged to come forward with any information they had, but however, each lead ultimately resulted in a dead end. Eventually, the case of Janelle's strange disappearance went cold. Law enforcement started taking a closer look at Leon and Tanya. Cell phone records and witness testimonies ultimately contradicted Tanya's initial timeline of events. Not to mention Leon, who at this point was nowhere to be found, implicated the couple even further. Subsequently, authorities launched a manhunt and eventually tracked Leon to a U-Haul facility in DeKalb County, just outside of Atlanta, on May 23, 2017. In the passenger seat of the truck was Janelle's mother, Tanya. Evidently, Leon and Tanya had plans to flee as the U-Haul was packed to the brim with virtually all their personal belongings. Luckily, authorities had caught up with them before they had the chance, and Leon and Tanya were taken into custody without incident. During Leon Tripp's interrogation, he inadvertently revealed critical moments of inconsistency, all while implying knowledge of Janelle's brutal fate. At first, he was defiant with the police. However, Leon's facade began to crumble under pressure when he told detectives that he never went to help his friend with his car troubles in South Carolina. Instead, he claimed he and Janelle drove to Atlanta before providing his stepdaughter with some cash and instructing her to catch a bus back to Augusta. According to his new version of events, that was the last time he ever saw Janelle. During Tanya's police interview, evidence soon revealed her active participation would appear to be a cover-up, as well as her being complicit in the crime. During Tanya's interrogation, her statements were inconsistent throughout. She was often deflecting questions asked by investigators. Initially, she claimed to have no knowledge of Janelle's whereabouts, aligning with Leon's story. Investigators, however, confronted her with evidence, including cell phone records and witness statements, which contradicted her so-called alibi. Authorities ultimately recovered text messages between Leon and Tanya that indicated their plans to, quote, handle Janelle and stay on the same page. Authorities also learned that both Tanya and Leon had been using an app on their cell phones, allegedly attempting to create fake IDs following Janelle's disappearance. While there wasn't enough evidence to charge either of them with the teen's murder, a substantial development in the case finally came several months later. Roughly 1 year after Janelle's disappearance, on March 8, 2018, investigators received an anonymous phone call regarding the discovery of human remains. When authorities arrived on the scene, a female's body was located in a shallow grave off of Golden Camp Road in Richmond County, Georgia. The property was vacant, previously foreclosed on, and owned by the bank at the time. As far as the victim, an identification came quickly through dental records, which were ultimately matched to Janelle's X-rays, taken from a dentist's visit shortly before she went missing. Reports from the autopsy indicated signs of blunt force trauma with possible asphyxiation. Investigators pieced together the killer likely struck Janelle to subdue her before using additional means to ensure her death. At the scene, strands of the liquor she used to commit the murder were located not far from the body. By now, investigators had finally pieced together enough evidence to show what really happened to Janelle Carwell. On the night of April 17, 2017, Janelle was seemingly lured away under the pretense of helping with the car repair. This was the morning of her 16th birthday at 1:30 a.m. However, investigators determined that this was merely a cover for Leon's true intentions. Under the guise of needing her phone for directions, Leon proceeded to drive himself and his stepdaughter roughly 20 miles north to Clarks Hill, South Carolina. However, somewhere along the way, Leon pulled the car over. Once isolated in a remote area, Leon overpowered Janelle using restraints to incapacitate her. Forensic evidence indicated signs of ligature marks suggesting she was bound before her death. The exact method of her murder remains undisclosed to this day, but the brutality of the act was undeniable. After Leon killed the teen, he contacted Tanya, who helped him clean the scene and transport Janelle's body to a secluded location near their home. Under the cover of darkness, they dug the shallow grave where Janelle was ultimately found over 1 year later. The haste in which they disposed of her body reflected not just callousness, but a calculated effort to evade justice. What I'll do is give you a brief timeline of when the investigation started, where we are, and then kind of open it up for some questions. Please understand, as you know, that it's still an ongoing investigation. We have some of the information I can't reveal. It'll be an action question, but just understand that's something that I cannot state because of the fact that this investigation is still moving forward. On April 18, 2017, Tanya Tripp first reported that her daughter, LaTanya Carlwell, and her husband, Leon Tripp, were missing. That started a missing persons investigation with the sheriff's office. During the investigation, based on information we received from LaTanya Tripp, it was believed, though late to believe, that Leon Tripp had driven himself, along with her 16-year-old daughter, LaTanya, to the Atlanta area in their white GMC truck. On April 23rd, that truck was located on the 3000 block of Woodbrook Court, which is the rival court from the original address. The investigation continued. More and more inconsistencies became prevalent in Tanya Tripp's testimony. So on May 1st, the sheriff's office applied for a warrant for kidnapping against Leon Tripp. Approximately 22 days later, on May 23rd, after receiving information and tips from the U.S. Marshals Service, located Leon Tripp in the Atlanta, Georgia area. To our surprise, Tanya Tripp was also accompanying Leon Tripp. On August 23rd, warrants were applied for and obtained for murder on Leon Tripp and for concealing the death of another Tanya Tripp in reference to the disappearance of her daughter, the 16-year-old Janelle Carlwell. At that time, the body had been recovered, but based on information throughout the investigation, we felt confident to move forward with a murder investigation and no longer a missing person or a kidnapper. On March 8th of 2018, we received a phone call from a citizen that they were surveying the backyard of a residence at 2211 Golden Camp Road and discovered what they believed to be human remains. At that time, the scene was secured. We made contact with Dr. Alice Gooding, anthropologist contracted through the GBI. The scene was secured on March 9th. Investigators, along with Dr. Gooding, returned to the Golden Camp Road address and conducted a thorough forensic at the product D of the site where the remains were located. Once those remains were collected, they were gathered, turned over to the coroner's office, and then transported to the GBI crime lab for autopsy and identification. On March 12th, of course, there was a course of investigation because we did have a missing person. We were able to obtain general records of Lieutenant Carlwell. Those records were delivered to the GBI crime lab in Atlanta, at which time they confirmed through those general records that the remains that we had discovered on Golden Camp Road was in fact that of Lieutenant Carlwell. This has been a long and exhausting investigation, but it will not conclude until the successful prosecution of Leon and Lieutenant Tripp. I would like to thank my investigators, as well as operational support personnel, for their tireless efforts in the recovery of Janelle, in the recovery of the remains of Janelle's body. Also, the community support has been overwhelming as they have embraced this case as if Janelle was their own child. Without the help of the community, I don't feel that this case would be at this stage. As I stated earlier, this case is far from over, but at least now the community can find peace that Janelle can finally be laid to rest, and we can move forward with the prosecution. Following their arrest, Tanya Tripp's bond was originally set at $500,000, however, it was later updated to $880,400. And as for Leon, he was denied bond altogether. Both defendants were charged with a range of crimes, including malice murder, felony murder, kidnapping with bodily injury, and concealing a death. Initially, prosecutors sought the death penalty, citing the premeditated and heinous nature of the crime. However, in 2023, the state re-indicted the couple, opting for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This decision aimed to expedite the judicial process and provide a measure of closure for Janelle's family. Following multiple delays, Tanya and Leon both saw their day in court in 2024. At trial, the harrowing details regarding the events leading to Janelle's death were revealed. Prosecutors presented a wealth of evidence, including forensic analysis, digital communication records, and testimonies from witnesses who recounted the couple's suspicious behavior. Investigators highlighted the calculated nature of their actions, emphasizing the cruelty of their betrayal. Defense attorneys for Leon argued that Tanya was the mastermind, while Tanya's legal team portrayed her as a victim manipulated by Leon. Prosecutors introduced evidence that indicated that Leon and Tanya Tripp had previously solicited someone to kill Janelle on 3 separate occasions between 2015 and 2016. In addition, the strands of ligatures located at the crime scene showed the presence of DNA, which ultimately came back as a match to the victim's stepfather. Furthermore, the state called upon experts concerning both defendants' cell phone data. More specifically, pings from local cell towers ultimately placed both Leon and Tanya at the dump site shortly after Janelle was murdered. As if that wasn't enough, perhaps the most damning piece of evidence came from when the soil samples were presented in court. Various forensic analysts took to the stand to testify, establishing that the dirt recovered from the crime scene matched that of soil particles located in Leon's pickup truck following the murder. Both of them maintained their innocence despite the overwhelming evidence there is against them. In the wake of Janelle's death, the community rallied together, organizing vigils and fundraisers to honor her memory. A GoFundMe campaign was established to cover funeral expenses and support her siblings. A church where Janelle was an active member held a memorial service, drawing hundreds of attendees who shared stories of her kindness and generosity. Janelle's funeral was held 3 days before her 17th birthday at Great Young Zion Baptist Church in Augusta, Georgia. Her deeply emotional event drew hundreds who gathered to pay their respects, celebrating her life while mourning her untimely death. Friends and family shared heartfelt tributes, remembering Janelle's warmth, intelligence, and boundless potential. The funeral served as both a farewell and a call to action, urging attendees to advocate for justice and the protection of children. While her family continues to grieve, they remain committed to honoring Janelle's memory through outreach and awareness efforts. The handling of Janelle's disappearance by law enforcement faced criticism. Delays in treating her case as a potential homicide may have hindered early investigative efforts. Early on, law enforcement treated Janelle as a runaway, despite her responsible nature both in and out of school. This delayed critical search efforts by nearly a week. That is huge in a missing persons case. In addition, authorities had actually located Leon's pickup truck abandoned halfway between Augusta and Clarks Hill, South Carolina early on. Not only did this indicate that the two never made it to Clarks Hill, but this crucial lead should have been taken more seriously by police. This case highlights the importance of swift action and thorough protocols when dealing with missing persons, particularly minors. Advocacy groups have since called for reforms in how such cases are managed, emphasizing the need for better training and resources for law enforcement. Janelle's story is a stark reminder of the work still needed to protect vulnerable individuals. Case 7. Cameron Athena Jean Schlitter was born in Cedar Rapids, Iowa on September 23, 2008. The parents Zaria Schlitter and Nicole King. She was described as a happy child with a contagious smile. After the couple ended their relationship in November of 2009, they initially shared custody of Cameron. However, Nicole soon faced financial instability after moving out of the family home. Struggling to provide for Cameron, Nicole asked Zaria to care for her temporarily while she got back on her feet. In February of 2010, Zaria was granted temporary custody of Cameron, giving him primary care of their daughter, while Nicole searched for a permanent living situation. A short time later, Zaria began a relationship with a woman named Amy Jo Palmer, who had 2 children of her own. Amy harbored a sense of resentment towards Cameron from the very start, and sources close to the family later recalled how Amy had little to no patience for her. Just months after she was born, Cameron's health and behavior declined drastically under both Zaria and Amy's care. When Cameron started daycare in early March 2010, she initially adjusted well. She played with the other children, ate well, and napped without any issue whatsoever. However, the first week that she was there, the staff noticed bruises and abrasions on her skin. When confronted about this, Zaria and Amy initially provided their own excuses, claiming that Cameron had fallen or that she was hitting herself. They kept referring to her as being a little brat. On another occasion, Amy claimed Cameron's bruises were from bumping into a bookshelf, but later said that a pack and play had fallen on her. It became evident to the daycare staff almost right away that something was wrong, that Cameron was more than likely suffering some form of violence behind closed doors. Once energetic and full of life, Cameron eventually became withdrawn and lethargic. She would allegedly wake up screaming from nightmares. By now, she had also lost a significant amount of weight, something that daycare workers also noticed. Amy and Zaria both claimed that Cameron had been refusing to eat. It was around this same time when Zaria took Cameron to a clinic for pink eye and reported his daughter's decreased appetite and poor sleep. At the time, a nurse practitioner noted a golf ball-sized bruise on Cameron's forehead, but Zaria's explanation that she hit a coffee table seemed plausible at the time. As the days went on, Cameron's injuries only seemed to worsen, arriving at daycare with more and more bruises, now concealed by skin toner and makeup applications. Between March 6th and March 21st, Cameron continued to suffer at the hands of her caregivers. On one occasion, a daycare worker noticed that Cameron was struggling to walk. They did report the incident to Child Services, however, for some reason, Cameron was allowed to remain under the care of both Zaria and Amy. One afternoon, daycare staff noted that Cameron developed a fever and failed to show up for the rest of the week. In the days that followed, Cameron's suffering would finally come to an end, but at the cost of her innocent life. On March 21st, 2010, Amy called 911, claiming that Cameron was unresponsive. Paramedics swiftly arrived on the scene, only to find that the toddler was barely breathing. Cameron's head was swollen, her body was riddled with bruises that covered her entire face, arms, and legs. She was immediately rushed to the hospital, where doctors determined that Cameron had suffered severe head trauma, brain swelling, and additional internal injuries, all indicative of prolonged physical violence. According to Dr. Michael D'Alessandro, a radiologist at the University of Iowa Children's Hospital, Cameron's acute brain hemorrhaging and massive swelling suggested that her injuries occurred within hours of the 911 call. The force needed to cause this injury was extreme, consistent with a child being violently shaken, slammed, or struck against a hard surface. The severity of Cameron's injuries led doctors to perform emergency surgery in an attempt to relieve the swelling in her brain. A portion of her skull was removed, but they found that the damage was just too severe. Despite this, the swelling continued. Doctors made a final attempt to save Cameron's life by placing a drain in her skull to remove excess fluid. Unfortunately, this too failed. Cameron was then placed in a medically induced coma, her last chance at survival. A nurse who was present during one of Zaria's visits later testified that he walked to Cameron's bedside, looked at her, and quietly said, "I'm sorry." While this statement might have seemed remorseful, hospital staff noted that he showed visible emotion at seeing his daughter in a state. Less than a week later, and after 2 failed brain surgeries, 18-month-old Cameron Schlitter was tragically pronounced dead after being removed from life support on March 28, 2010. An autopsy confirmed that Cameron had suffered multiple head injuries at different times leading up to her death. The medical examiner ultimately concluded repeated assaults led to her fatal brain injuries and ruled Cameron's death a homicide. Following their interviews with police and subsequent arrests, Amy claimed that on March 21st, she had awoken Cameron from a nap at around 3:30 p.m. After bathing her 4 hours later and putting her to bed, she claimed to have retrieved Cameron's blanket and favorite toy. When she returned, Amy claimed that Cameron's eyes had somehow rolled back in her head, her body had stiffened, and she began convulsing, which according to her was when she called 911. Amy and Zaria denied ever hitting Cameron. During his police interviews, Zaria admitted that he occasionally became frustrated with his daughter, but that he never once harmed her. He went on to say that Cameron had become more clingy and irritable after recovering from an ear infection and pink eye leading up to her death, but once her fever broke, she returned to normal health. When asked about the day Cameron was rushed to the hospital, Zaria told investigators he was at home watching her, but that she was really whiny and kept following him around. He also revealed that Cameron had only slept 3 hours the night before. When asked about his girlfriend Amy's potential involvement, Zaria defended her, claiming that Amy was too nice to commit any acts of violence towards his daughter. Zaria first told police he was unaware of Cameron's bruises, but later admitted he saw them and that he had been rough with her. While being questioned, he eventually admitted to becoming frustrated with Cameron and frequently needed to step away to cool down. He went on to make an odd comment, stating that someone making an educated guess would think he was responsible for the injuries because all the arrows are pointing to him. Still, he denied any involvement in his daughter's death. Evidence recovered from the home, however, told a much different and darker story than what either Amy or Zaria had provided to police. Investigators ultimately found a tissue in Amy's home with Cameron's DNA and traces of makeup on it, the same type used to cover her bruises, reinforcing the possibility of ongoing violence in the home. Months after Cameron's death, Zaria reached out to investigators on his own accord, informing authorities that he wanted to help in the case. In his shocking admission, his story changed completely, now acknowledging that he noticed Cameron's bruises for weeks before her death, and that he himself had been, as he put it, harsh with Cameron at times. On Thursday, April 1st, 2010, a visitation was held at the Cedar Memorial Park Funeral Home in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Family and friends gathered to grieve and share memories, attempting to find solace in the wake of this unspeakable tragedy. The following day, a private family service took place where the closest to Cameron said their final farewells at Cedar Memorial Park Cemetery, where she was buried. Both Zaria Schlitter and Amy Palmer were initially charged with first-degree murder and child endangerment, resulting in death. However, the charges for both defendants were later reduced to child endangerment and involuntary manslaughter. At Zaria's trial, Cameron's mother, Nicole, testified that Zaria had been physically aggressive with their daughter prior to their separation. She recalled an incident where he once angrily threw blankets into Cameron's crib and cursed at her for crying. According to Nicole, this event was a major catalyst in their relationship, which led to the couple breaking up. During the month Cameron was in Zaria's care, Nicole attempted to see her frequently. She told the court how she noticed bruises on Cameron's face between March 8th and 12th, and by March 17th, Cameron seemed withdrawn, sick, and medicated. She noticed that a plum-sized bruise had appeared on her forehead. While visiting Nicole's aunt on March 19th, Cameron screamed and pulled out her own hair, only to suddenly calm down when they were about to leave. Nicole initially believed Amy was solely responsible for the violence. However, her perspective shifted after seeing photographs of Cameron's bruises and fingernail marks on her body. Nicole testified that the fingernail marks were consistent with how Zaria would roughly pick up Cameron, and she did not believe Amy was capable of causing those specific injuries. Nicole had also revealed that Zaria had contacted her 2 days before the trial, asking her to talk him up and support his version of events when she testified. One of the doctors who tried to save the young girl's life also testified in court, establishing that Cameron's brain injuries were consistent with repeated trauma, and her hair pulling was likely a reaction to stress. In addition, the prosecution called several members of Cameron's daycare staff to the stand who testified about how Zaria had dismissed concerns about Cameron's injuries, claiming that he simply hadn't noticed them. However, records showed that he had given conflicting answers on different occasions regarding how Cameron had been hurt. In 2010, Zaria Schlitter was found guilty of child endangerment resulting in death and involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Upon appeal, the Iowa Supreme Court granted Zaria Schlitter a new trial in 2016. This came as a result of alleged ineffective counsel during his initial proceedings. Ahead of his second trial, Zaria entered an Alford plea to reduce charge of child endangerment, resulting in bodily injury. This type of plea allows the defendant to maintain innocence while acknowledging that the prosecution's evidence could likely lead to a conviction. Consequently, in August of 2017, Zaria was sentenced to 3 years of probation and was allowed to walk free after serving just 4 years behind bars. As for his girlfriend and co-defendant Amy Palmer, she was convicted of the same charges, but she would not be as lucky as he was. At her trial held in August of 2013, text messages Amy sent became crucial evidence for the state. In one, she referred to Cameron as the most obnoxious kid in the world, while others sent to coworkers stated the following, I quote, "I might have killed a kid." Timothy Sprouse, Amy's former boyfriend, also testified, revealing to the court that after a night of drinking in April of 2011, Amy became emotional and told Timothy that he shouldn't become too attached to her because she was likely going to prison for killing an 18-month-old child. On the stand, Timothy went on to say that Amy made mention of head trauma being a contributing factor in the child's death. Aside from expressing concern that she would surely lose custody of her 2 surviving children, Amy remained aloof and didn't provide much more detail during her conversation with Timothy. During closing arguments, Amy's lawyers did their best to suggest reasonable doubt in this case, even went as far as blaming the toddler's mother, Nicole King. But it's important to note that Nicole was never charged with a crime. These accusations prevented by the defense resulted in outbursts with members of the King family exiting the courtroom. In the end, 29-year-old Amy Palmer was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and child endangerment, was later sentenced to the maximum allowed in the state of Iowa, 50 years in prison without the possibility of probation. In addition, Amy was also required to pay $150,000 in restitution. To some extent, justice had been served, but how Zaria was allowed to walk free after his involvement in his daughter's murder is beyond our wildest comprehension. And while no conviction or prison sentence could bring back Cameron, there is no question that her death came as a result of the failures of all those who should have protected her, those whose job it was to make sure she was protected. Several years before and on the other side of the country, in the state of Rhode Island, another innocent child, Thomas J. Wright, would endure a similarly brutal fate, one marked by unrelenting violence, systemic failure, and horrifying betrayal. September 11th, 2001 is a day that will live on in infamy for many Americans, but it was also the birthday of Thomas J. Wright, affectionately known as TJ. He was born in Leominster, Massachusetts to David and Karen Wright of Woonsocket, Rhode Island, and was one of 5 children. However, shortly after TJ was born, his parents separated. Almost as soon as the little boy came into this world, patterns of violence became evident. TJ had fallen from a second-story window on 3 separate occasions, yet it wasn't until the 3rd incident that a caseworker was assigned. Several more reports were made when neighbors heard a child's screams coming from inside the apartment. Despite this, no legal action came as a result. A short time later, TJ's mother was arrested and sent to prison to serve a 2.5-year sentence for charges related to weed. In January of 2004, DCYF placed TJ in the care of his aunt, 24-year-old Catherine Bonnell, and her boyfriend, 27-year-old Gilbert Delestri. Catherine was unemployed and a known drug user. Placing these children in the custody of Catherine and Gilbert would soon prove to be one of the worst mistakes the state of Rhode Island has ever made. On the night of October 29, 2004, Catherine and Gilbert left 3-year-old TJ in the care of a 15-year-old babysitter named Kayla, while the two went out for drinks at a local nightclub with Gilbert's cousin. When they returned to the Walnut Hill Apartments on Diamond Hill Road in Woonsocket hours later, they found the babysitter fast asleep on the couch and a bowl of yogurt and milk spilled all over the floor. The babysitter awoke to find Catherine screaming in a fit of rage, and Gilbert went upstairs to TJ's room where several slaps could be heard, followed by TJ's cries. The babysitter then witnessed Catherine storm upstairs, where she grabbed TJ by his arms and began dragging him back down to the first floor, deliberately slamming her knee into his back with each step. When they reached the bottom, Catherine threw TJ onto the floor with such force that his face bounced off the ground. As he lay sobbing, struggling to understand why he was being hurt, Catherine continued. She repeatedly punched him in the chest, stomach, and back with a closed fist. While ignoring his cries, Catherine began to shout, "Why did you mess up my floor? What is the matter with you? Why did you do this in the living room?" But the torture didn't stop there. Catherine, ignoring TJ's injuries, decided to humiliate him further. She poured milk over his head and continued screaming at him, blaming him for the mess, shouting, "You want to waste my milk? You want to waste my fucking milk?" At this point, Catherine turned to the babysitter and suggested that she leave. Once she did, Gilbert joined in on the attack by lifting TJ into the air and throwing him across the room. TJ's body traveled several feet before landing on the floor with his legs twisted beneath him. Gilbert then picked TJ up and placed him on the steps. With his breathing becoming increasingly labored, Gilbert slapped the boy, causing him to fall down roughly 6 to 8 steps, at which time TJ lost consciousness. Gilbert's cousin, who was in the car at the time, eventually heard the noise and ran inside and attempted to intervene. But instead of calling for help, Catherine blocked him from trying to help the boy. Gilbert then picked up the boy's motionless body, carried him back up to his room, and placed him in his crib. Several minutes later, Gilbert suggested Catherine go check on him, but TJ was barely breathing. In a panic, she dumped cold water on him in an attempt to wake him up, but TJ still wasn't moving and his face had turned blue. That's when Catherine finally decided to call 911, where she told the dispatcher that TJ was sick and that they needed an ambulance. When paramedics arrived at 3:30 a.m., they found TJ in his crib with black eyes, blood in his mouth, and vomit covering his mattress. He was rushed to Landmark Medical Center in Woonsocket, where doctors immediately recognized the severity of his condition. He was placed on life support and later transported to Hasbro Children's Hospital. TJ's left arm was broken, and doctors who attempted to save his life described his condition as looking like he'd been in a boxing match. Despite medical intervention, the extent of the little boy's injuries left little hope. At noon on October 31st, 2004, TJ was removed from life support and was pronounced dead. As for the parties responsible, Catherine Bennell initially claimed ignorance, telling officers that when she returned home, she simply found TJ clinging to life. She even attempted to shift the blame onto their babysitter, Kayla. She also tried to coerce TJ's siblings, who were also present and witnessed the attack, into repeating her false narrative. Authorities immediately saw through Catherine's lies. When the babysitter was questioned, she told police how she had witnessed Catherine beating TJ as if he were a teenager. She described the brutality in chilling detail, recounting how Catherine's punches and kicks were full force and landing without mercy. The autopsy ultimately confirmed the babysitter's account. TJ's injuries were extensive and consistent with repeated blunt force trauma, including fractures to his skull, broken ribs, as well as the fracture to his left arm. At just 3 years old, 32 pounds, TJ had been beaten to death. Following the fatal attack, Catherine and Gilbert were arrested and charged with second-degree murder and conspiracy to murder. TJ's funeral was held on Friday, November 5, 2004, at Brandon Funeral Home in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. The service was followed by a burial at Forest Hill Cemetery. Family and community members gathered to mourn the heartbreaking loss of such a young life. During her trial, roughly 4 years later, in May of 2008, Catherine admitted to hitting the child, but attempted to shift the blame onto her boyfriend Gilbert, claiming that he alone delivered TJ's fatal injuries. However, forensic evidence proved that Catherine had initiated the violence and Gilbert had continued it. Autopsy findings ultimately revealed that TJ had suffered a massive subdural hematoma, the result of severe blunt force trauma, causing significant swelling in his brain. The injuries to his head were extensive, including multiple bruises covering his scalp and a large, dark contusion measuring about 4 to 6 inches marred his forehead. On his cheek, 4 parallel bruises were present, a telltale sign of one of many forceful slaps. Deep bite marks were also discovered on TJ's tongue, evidence that in his final moments of suffering, the child had clenched his teeth in agony as a result of the continued assault against him. Gilbert refused to testify in his own defense, remaining silent in court. Lack of remorse and refusal to acknowledge his role in TJ's murder only strengthened the prosecution's case. One of the most damning pieces of testimony came from Gilbert's cousin, who stated that Catherine physically prevented him from helping TJ when the child lost consciousness. The prosecution argued that this demonstrated clear intent to let the child die. Karen Wright, TJ's biological mother and Catherine's sister, addressed the court during victim impact statements where she supported Catherine, insisting that she was innocent and that Gilbert was the sole culprit in the crime. At one point during the trial, Karen screamed from outside the courtroom, stating the following, "I want my baby back. I want my baby back. He killed him. He did that. He did that." In the end, the jury found Catherine Bennell guilty of second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Catherine appealed her conviction, but was denied. Months later, that October, she was sentenced to life in prison for murder and an additional 10 years for conspiracy. At Gilbert's trial, he was convicted on the same charges and also received a life sentence. In November of 2024, 20 years after her conviction, Catherine was up for parole. But just like her appeal for a retrial, she was denied. She will be eligible for parole again in 2026. Like in nearly all of the cases we cover, there were several missteps by the powers that be. Officials later admitted that they were unaware that Gilbert had previously been caught with a massive quantity of drugs during a traffic stop. In the wake of TJ's death, a state panel concluded that DCYF never should have placed the children in Catherine's custody. The agency's negligence ultimately became a key allegation in a 2018 civil lawsuit exposing widespread failures in Rhode Island's foster care system. Underscoring of TJ's death could and should have been prevented. State reforms included enhanced training for caseworkers, stricter vetting procedures for foster placements, including mandatory criminal background checks and home visits. The settlement also provided financial compensation to TJ's surviving family members. After examining these two cases, one thing is certain, and that's the fact that Cameron Schlitter and Thomas J. Wright should still be here today. Their lives were stolen by cruelty, and their cries for help ignored. We owe it to them to demand change, to ensure that no child suffers as they did. Child homicide remains a deeply troubling issue here in the United States. Between 1999 and 2020, the overall child homicide rate increased annually by an average of 4.3%. with a sharp rise observed from 2019 to 2020. More times than not, family members are almost always the perpetrators. These statistics highlight the urgent need for strategies to protect vulnerable children and address contributing factors before it is too late. Cameron and TJ should be remembered not just as victims, but as symbols of the urgent need for reform. Their stories must not be forgotten. Both children were under the care of adults who should have nurtured and protected them. Instead, they suffered unimaginable violence at the hands of those they trusted the most.